Is it still snowing up there, Taylor?
No, it's cold. It's been freezing, but not tons of snow.
Dude, it was cold here. It was nasty cold for a couple of days. And now it's like back into the 40s and it's supposed to be like 59 on Saturday.
Wow,
So,
59? I think
yeah,
it's
dude.
supposed to like get into the high 30s here in a few days. So,
That's called summer in North Dakota.
yeah.
Um, but awesome. Well, dude, thanks for taking this one on because like I'll be honest, when I was sitting down praying about I should have do this particular covenant, the law of chastity, I was really kind of worried before, I got your name to come up because I'm like, this I've seen a couple of like gospel doctrine classes where this has felt like when your old man gave you the uncomfortable talk, right? And so, dude, I appreciate you doing it because I know you're going to bring something to the table that is pretty enriching, and I have nothing but hopes from here on.
Well, hope I don't disappoint. I'll definitely do my best,
You'll do great.
there's some things that I think will be interesting for people to maybe that they've never considered before. But ultimately, I think that my bigger goal is not to be informational, but more like let's see what we can take away from this conversation that's tangible that we can put into practice in our lives and have it maybe be a little more transformational. That's my hope and goal and prayer for this conversation.
Awesome. All right, dude, let's get into it.
Yeah, we might even offend some people and talk about some controversial stuff. So
That
we'll
happens. That
we'll
happens
see what we
here
can pack in.
all the time. Um, if people haven't figured out that you're going to be challenged listening to this podcast, whether you're a fundamentalist, an active LDS person, or whatever, they haven't listened long enough. So,
I saw a hilarious thing on a whiteboard just in a basement room in our church last Sunday, whenever that was, yesterday. Oh, been a long day. But it just made me laugh. It says, "The truth will set you free." And then somebody else in a different color of the white dry erase markers like, "But first it'll piss you off."
that's true. That's true. It'll piss you off and it's going to make you miserable first. That's
Yeah.
all there is to it.
Hmm.
So, that's just part of the game, I think. But that I think in some ways that's the beautiful thing. I think so often we struggle with certain doctrines or certain ideas that have been passed along to us. And in the moment, it feels like you're under some distress, right? But sometimes I think we forget that sometimes that's where the growth happens, right? And I know at least for me, I've looked back on certain challenging items and been like, oh, that's where the growth took place,
Right.
right? And that's when I was really studying hard because I needed to understand. So I think the law of chastity is like that with a lot of other things.
Yeah. Awesome. So so the law of chastity, I mean, the simple definition is faithfulness to marriage vows,
Right.
right? Like, about as cut and dry simple as it can be. Um, I think it's interesting, like where does the word come from in English? So it comes from Latin, which it was castus, and then it kind of evolved into castitas, and then Old French was chastet, and then into English it became chaste or chastity. And so this is kind of, and the reason I think that that's interesting to start with is it's such a big deal for us, especially in Mormon culture. Like it's a big deal, and I don't mean to diminish how important and the moral fidelity to our marriage vows and sexual purity and those types of things. It is really important. It's a big deal. But the word chastity, as we use it, didn't exist in the ancient days. It's not really something that there is a clear equivalent. Because there's some stuff that we would just be abhorred by that's described kind of like just very casually in some, especially the Old Testament types of
Right.
things. And I'm certainly not advocating any of that, but I think that sometimes I just want to kind of begin with providing the perspective that we can't judge everything anciently and scripturally through our modern lens because it leads to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. And so we may challenge maybe some of our, I guess a word to describe it might be puritanical tendencies in
Right.
our uh, you know American slash Christian slash Mormon cultures. And so yeah, but so what is the law of chastity? Faithfulness to our marriage covenants. I mean, we could just stop there and go to
Good
bed
night,
early.
everybody. Yeah.
But no, so going a little bit deeper, let's talk about vows versus covenants. And because marriage traditionally there's different levels or you could say even degrees of marriage. And so there's and they're not equal. Like, for instance, a good way to kind of illustrate this principle is technically Bill and Hillary are married. Um,
Yeah, it's true.
Technically, that is true, right? But that's not what we're interested in. And so, but let's have a conversation about what marriage is and isn't, and let's talk about maybe some different degrees or levels of marriage. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that marriage is marriage. Like
Right.
even if it's a crappy marriage, it's still a marriage. Even if it's a terrible marriage, an abusive marriage, it's a marriage until certain lines get crossed, and then and then but then it's dissolved, but it was a marriage while it lasted, type of a thing.
Right.
Um, and then, but there's a difference between just marriage and like godly marriage or celestial marriage, or, what we are trying to do, which is celestial eternal marriage,
Right.
covenants and bonds that are going to last beyond this life. So I think it's important to note that culturally, and biblically, like especially in the Old Testament, marriage is kind of less than what we would maybe expect. And what I mean by that is God talks about marriage as he performs the first marriage in the garden and commands them to be one flesh, and essentially there's not like a priest involved. There's not like a marriage certificate or license. Like those things are just kind of silly to even say, right? But but so what is marriage? It's, I mean, ideally something that God ordains, or
Right.
it's according like so I guess that's maybe another thing we can talk about later on in the conversation, which is, the difference between a good marriage versus a revealed marriage, something
Right.
God has really done, had a hand in. Um, okay, so there's that. There's the word adultery. You can't really have a conversation about marriage and chastity without also covering terms like adultery.
Right.
And, the word adultery is fascinating, because it has the word adult, like adult, and it kind of has the same. The word is etymology. It's like, where does this word come from? How do we get this English word adultery? And it comes from the Latin word adulterate. And adulterate, when you adulterate something, you are contaminating it.
Okay.
Okay, so this contamination,
Interesting.
yeah, so this contamination concept is it's bringing something into a unit which is foreign, or which, like you can adulterate various things. If you get too much water in the gas, it's not going to burn. It's been adulterated. If you put uh, you know impurities into other chemicals, then it can change the actual chemical structures, and it causes problems that way.
Right.
So adultery being that concept where where impurities are introduced into something. And I think we need to go back to, the scriptural terms where it talks about marriage. God commands a man to leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be made one flesh. This is right in Genesis, right? And so, especially with the perspective that we are blessed with from the restoration, um, when you are married, you are no longer an individual, two individuals. You
Right.
become you become one. Now, we still have our own bodies, and she's still a woman, I'm still a man. It's not like you don't want to get too caught up in but as far as in God's perspective, marriage is the bringing together of a woman and man and becoming something new. It's like when you have a chemical reaction in the
Yes.
beaker or in chemistry, like you used to have two separate ingredients, now you got one ingredient, but it's different than either of the two things was beforehand.
Right.
So, so anyway, hopefully,
No,
I'm
I think that's good because we can't have this conversation without setting the terms, right?
right.
And this unity within marriage, I think, is a huge part of this covenant that we take at the temple, right? Because
Mhm.
I think if we truly understand the covenant, it'll point to exactly what you just pointed to, is that God no longer looks at you as just a dude or just a woman, right? You have now come together, and out of that, there is a new. And again, I don't want anyone to get new agey with this either, right?
Exactly.
I want to be very careful in that,
That's
right?
the balance, the
That's
needle we're
yeah,
trying to thread here.
yeah. So right, so like if your local guru teaches you this, just maybe raise an eyebrow. But what I would say is that without the new agey kind of thing, it is kind of like a new person almost, right? Or a new
A new
unit, right?
unit. Yeah, that's a good word.
It's a new way of being recognized, right? You are no longer the individual. You are now coupled with your eternal companion from here on out, and God's going to look at that. And if that's how he's going to view things, well, now also there's some new things that are probably required of that weren't required as a single man or woman.
Correct.
So,
Yeah. So when you know, biblical scriptural marriage, and we're not talking about revealed marriage, we're not talking about godly marriage, not talking about celestial marriage necessarily, but we're just talking about marriage, which is still marriage, does not require a marriage license from you don't need permission from the government, from the judge, from the courthouse, or none of that. Like that's just kind of a silly modern thing that was invented, I believe, in like the 1860s to regulate interracial marriage. Anyway, we won't get into all that history, but so like that is an invention of men. That definition is somewhat arbitrary.
right,
And the reason that the LDS, I think this is maybe important for this audience to understand, the reason our LDS tradition became basically conflated with that perspective was because post 1890, the government needed to regulate marriage,
yep,
and when the church signed the manifesto, they were essentially abdicating that ability to self-govern, and as far as the terms of marriage go and what that union is and isn't, to the government and let the government regulate it. So when that happens, you now suddenly you need a marriage license because your marriage has to be sanctioned by the state, and
you
that's how you get rid of plural marriage
yep,
overnight. Is because this, of course, the state had banned plural marriage in the civil code.
yep. Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating too. This is just another case study, and it's something I've been flirting with for a while. This idea that Mormonism really was meant to be a counterculture, right? Um, and sometimes I feel like the good red indicator light on if you're off track on this is this counterculture looking too much like the culture at large. Um, and I think this is one of those ways where we can see that happen is through marriage, right? You get the sense that Joseph was on to building new societies, not just buildings or printing books, right? This was about a different way of living. And we should expect to see some differences in how we would view that marriage versus the world at large.
Yeah, absolutely. And so basically going back to what marriage is and isn't, sometimes people think that, okay, well, certainly amongst certain fundamentalists, like there's a clear understanding that you don't need a license for a marriage to be valid in God's sight. Um, but they still think that there needs to be a ceremony or it doesn't count. And especially this bothers me when I see, people who are sincere people trying to live the gospel and they get accused of adultery because they didn't get permission from their certain key holder,
Right.
if you will, to enter the principle, and then it becomes a finger pointing of, well, hey, you didn't get permission, therefore your marriage doesn't count, therefore you're living adultery, not polygamy. Um, and so I think we need to be very careful, like, marriage. No, there's not a chapter and verse that says that you have to have a priest or an ecclesiastic for marriage. Because, I mean, you think about all of the people, the thousands and millions and tens of billions of people that lived during periods of apostasy, and they were getting married and producing children. And marriage is ordained of God. And if they hadn't, the restoration couldn't have happened because the race would have died off.
Right.
So like this, so God ordains marriage, and all marriage is ordained of God. Now there are different degrees, and of course, some are far more have potential to become eternal unions, but that doesn't undo. It's not like everybody in the Middle Ages during the Great Apostasy was adulterers. That's
Right.
that's the point I'm trying to illustrate with that.
Yep.
Um, so marriage being that union of making two into a new unit, like a alchemical. I'll say alchemy because it's not chemistry, but and it's kind of mystical a little bit, but it is a producing something new from two distinct former ingredients, I guess is
Right.
if you frame that. So that's marriage, and it does not require a license. It does not require a priest or an ecclesiastical. It doesn't require a ceremony. What does it actually require? Let's look at even just some of the like Native Americans, right? They were living marriage and even plural marriage in many cases, like because they like to take care of their women and children that needed help and and were
Right.
in. And so they didn't really have, I mean, sometimes they would have a cultural celebration to kind of announce to the community and maybe strengthen one another's resolve to be faithful to their new partner in this life. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But all other times, a man and woman would just run off into the woods and come back and announce that they were married and start a family and they were now a couple. Like, and you can't tell me that that's adultery. It may not
Right.
be ideal, it may not be celestial, it may not be be may not last beyond this life, but it's not adultery. And that's just
Right.
what I wanted to kind of address. All right, so we've defined marriage, we've kind of qualified what it is and isn't, what God defines it as what it is or isn't. Now let's talk about, well, adultery. Adultery is uh it's one of the worst like words in the English language. I
It
mean,
really is. Yep.
it just you don't want to talk about, you don't even want to say it. And it's because it is the ultimate betrayal of trust. When you were married and you are no longer an individual, you are now a married man. You are now part of something else. You are one half of a couple. Um, that is one of the most sacred positions of trust that a human being can experience in this life. And, adultery is the ultimate betrayal of that trust. So, you know, let's get into some kind of, I think they're very interesting, they're very controversial kind of topics. Are you familiar with the term telegony?
No.
Okay. So this was something that it kind of was a big deal in like the last half of the 1800s, and then in the early 1900s, scientists kind of dismissed it. They're like, "Yeah, there's not enough evidence. It's kind of anecdotal and blah blah blah. So they kind of got away from it. And there was a recent study that was published. In fact, I even pulled it up just to.
Let me give
Um,
you. Do you want to share it, or
oh, sure, I can share.
let me
Just
let me
real quick.
get you the permissions there?
All right,
Okay, you should be good.
all right. We'll just share. Can you see my screen?
All right. Yep, got her.
All right. So this is the National Library of Medicine from NIH. And this is, you can see the title right here on the screen, Revisiting Telegony. Offspring inherit an acquired characteristic of their mother's previous mate.
What?
And this was published just pretty recent. I want to say 2014, 10 years ago,
Okay.
or I guess 10, just a little bit over 10 years ago. So basically, the history of telegony is that there was a horse like animal native to, I want to say it was Australia, if I recall, that was kind of like new. Nobody had ever seen this thing, and it was like a zebra. There were stripes and markings on it, but it was not a zebra, and it was not a horse. It was like this kind of genetic anomaly that people from the old world, like the rest of the world, because Australia is kind of unique. Australia has marsupials, everywhere else has mammals, and so Australia is pretty unique genetically. Um, and so that's why I'm pretty sure I'm recalling that was where it came from. Um, and so basically there was this horse and they thought, hey, we're going to see what happens if we breed it with a purebred Arabian mare, which is like, if you don't know
Right.
horses, that's like the gold standard of horse flesh. And so this Arabian mare was bred with this Australian. Uh, I don't know if maybe it's an stallion. I don't know what you would call it because it has a different word, and I don't remember what it was.
Kind of a
But
common quarter horse almost for that area,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and so it's just more of a common horse, and the colt that the mare gave birth to had the markings and they considered it a failure. They were hoping that it would like make it way cooler and it was just like a letdown. And they're like, "Well, we can't waste this Arabian purebred mare on any more offspring with this thing. So hey, case closed. That was a failed attempt to kind of try to genetically come up with a new type of a horse breed that could have been cool. And
Gotcha.
so and so basically they abandoned it and they sent the horse back to the normal breeding and she was bred with a purebred Arabian stallion and she gives birth to this colt and it has stripes.
What?
The second colt or after she
Right.
was with the Australian with the stripes has stripes and they know for a fact that it's impossible that the father was the Australian. Like purebred Arabians are very tightly controlled assets.
Right.
like it's a big deal to preserve that purity.
Absolutely.
And so they were like, well, that's weird.
Right.
Uh, Never doing that again. And so unfortunately, because this happened like 200 years ago, there was not a whole lot of, scientific rigor to, keep things. And so by the early 1900s, it was kind of dismissed as, well, there's not enough evidence. And nobody wants to risk because I mean, purebred horses are worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars,
Millions.
millions. And yeah, in some cases. And so like this interestingly does not appear to be a thing for all different types of animals. This is kind of unique to just certain, far more higher, like you could call them higher uh, organisms, like horses.
Gotcha.
Well, what was real interesting is they were doing a study on humans, and it was not like they were doing experiments and like having people breed or none of
Right.
that. What I mean is that they were doing a study of I believe it was like 8,000 women in this study that were participating that had volunteered, consented to be part of it. and they were basically just looking at different health parameters and different things, and they were studying different genetics. And I think it was basically trying to determine, what's the word? Uh, how you're raised versus genetics.
Nature versus nurture.
Nature versus nurture. Yeah, they were looking at some of that stuff. And what was, wildly unexpected by the research team that was conducting this study was that they were finding that some of these women had male DNA in their brains. And that was like shocker because these were women. Like, why do they have Y chromosomes floating around in their brains? And so the first hypothesis was, well, they must be mothers, and maybe they had sons, and so maybe some of that DNA, and then it just stayed in the mother's brain for the rest of their life, and so that explained a good percentage of them, but not all. Some of them either had not had children or had only had daughters, and they were still finding Y chromosomes in the females. And they're like, well, that's weird. We're not going to study this anymore, and it would be immoral to pursue this study any further. And they just kind of walked away. And I understand that it's very politically incorrect, or it would be extreme, like, and it would be wrong to like try to experiment and have humans intentionally try to
Right.
replicate these types of results, right? So I'm not advocating that that should have happened, but what this does seem to suggest is that there are consequences that every time a woman engages in a sexual interaction, there is a consequence that is a permanent alteration to that woman.
Interesting.
And the reason that that is controversial is because, well, the sexual revolution, people don't want to think that there's consequences
Right.
for, just, hookups or whatever. And so, I get it, but it's kind of hard to deny at this point that when a woman gives herself, and when a man in a marriage relationship receives the wife to himself, obviously genetic material is transferred between one half of this couple and the other half of the couple. One is the giver and one is the receiver. And when a woman receives genetic material from her husband, it changes her at the DNA, at the cellular level forever.
Wow. So that whole oneness in marriage could be a lot, not just spiritual, but on some level, even physical.
Yes. Yes. And like I say, I'm not this is not definitively proven. I am not qualified to definitively claim this or that. But the evidence that we do have, which is limited admittedly, does appear to support this idea that there is a physical reality to the spiritual union between a man and woman when they are married.
Right. Right. And I think this might be a good place to say, look, outside of marriage, I understand things happen, right?
Mhm.
I strive for the ideal, right? And that's what I'd want for all people. But we don't live in an ideal world and circumstance, right? And so I want to be careful to say that you should, if a woman's engaged in that before, she's not damaged goods, right?
Correct.
I want to get that out of the way. I hope that's okay. I interject that here. But
Please. I wanted to bring that up, and you beat me to it. Thank you.
I just want to say they're not damaged goods. And because of the atonement, all right, I'll go here. I might edit this later. So before I came into the gospel, I was a heavy drug user, right?
Hmm.
Even blew some veins out, if you know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh.
And so, like, I remember thinking I was damaged, right? Like, probably can't have kids. Who knows what I've done? I mean, it was ugly. It was very ugly. After I was baptized, though, a lot of those visible consequences that I'd had went away, right? The atonement is a very real thing, and it is a very real salve to not just our souls, but I believe our bodies, right? I do believe something changes when you start making covenants, not just spiritually, but physically, right? Um, I'm not saying it happens all the time, but I think for someone who's maybe truly repentant, those doors can be opened. And
Absolutely.
so if a man or a woman has engaged in premarital sex, they're not damaged goods, right? Through repentance, through the atonement, wholeness and healing can happen. And so I just wanted to get that out of the way right there.
No, excellent. I'm glad you brought that up because uh similarly the thing is with the gospel, like if we have all this record of Christ healing lepers and healing all of these physical maladies, and past mistakes, there are consequences, but like sometimes things just happen and you don't have any control, like if you're born blind or whatever.
Right.
And if Christ can heal that, like what's to stop God from using that power to restore something that maybe had been lost through previous. But yeah, of course, repentance must be complete and sincere. Um, and I did want to, since I've still got the screen share, I think I just wanted
Yeah.
to briefly just show that I'm not just pulling this out of thin air or out of other places. Uh, this is also on the National Library of Medicine. This was the study on male microchimerism in the human female brain. So this was published in 2012, September. Microchimerism is simply like small levels of genetic modification that has been observed uh,
Interesting.
in the human female brain. So that's so yeah, you can just look it up
Dude,
in
after
the
after we're
Library of
done,
Medicine.
can you just email me those two links and I'll just throw those in the show notes?
Absolutely. Yep, we'll do. All right, cool. So, how was that for controversial? Like, should we move on to something?
Dude, I liked it. That I'm here for it. And look, this is one of those where I'm gonna probably at the intro be like, put your kids to bed before you listen to this
Yeah,
one, folks. This one isn't for your younger kids, right? This is for probably 14 to 15 and on up. Um,
yeah. I'm trying to be as respectful as possible, but certain things are just there's no way around it. They're
no, no. Look,
they're
this is one of
mature.
those
Like,
topics why everybody shied away from it, right? Why people don't like giving this lesson in gospel doctrine, right? It you're talking about some intimate type things, and it can cause people to squirm a little bit.
right. All right, cool. Well, so going back to let's go back to Matthew. I believe it's chapter 5. In fact, I'm going to just pull up my scriptures. I was going to have this up and I forgot to prep it. So, but so this is Christ talking about the ye have heard of by them of old times, but I tell you, like he's basically setting a higher law, like thou
Right.
shalt not kill, but even if you just get angry, you know, that's wrong. Um, and then looking on a woman to lust after hath committed adultery and are already in his heart. Now, there is a difference. I think it's important to say there is a difference between thinking a thing and doing a thing.
Yep.
Uh, you know, but as Christians and as Mormons especially, we should be seeking to live a higher law, which
Yep.
would be controlling our thoughts because you don't do things that you haven't thought about first, generally.
And
Uh,
especially for Mormons, right? I mean, look, there's like if you're an active Mormon, there's certain apparel that you will wear that you have to get past to get down to that, right?
yeah,
And so if you know. you have to really think about something in order to get to that point in Mormonism, especially.
Yep. And so, in this same passage, Christ also addresses the concept of divorce. And what he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31, he says, "It hath been said of old, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I, Christ, say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that is divorced, committeth adultery."
Hmm.
Now, what's weird is this is clearly describing a married woman.
Right.
Put away his wife, like they're married. Wait, I thought that fornication meant premarital sex and adultery was, sex when you're married to somebody that's not your spouse. But Christ right here is saying that whosoever shall put away his wife, or in other words, if you divorce your wife, un causeth her to commit adultery unless she is committed fornication.
Interesting.
You ever noticed that before?
I have, and I have wondered what it meant.
All right, so this is not, I'm not speaking authoritatively or definitively on this, but I have thought a lot about it because, yeah, this was a puzzler for me. Like, what is going on here? And what I think is going on is that we misdefine the word fornication in our kind of English because it's all a translation. None of us is very few of us, I should say, are reading the historic like the source Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic texts. So we're all
Right.
reliant on English translations to comprehend in our native tongue. And so we as a result we bring our cultural baggage and the English the inherent limitations of the English language or the nuances of the English language into our readings with us. And so what I think is going on here is that um, you you can commit fornication if you're married because fornication is not simply premarital sex. What fornication actually is infidelity. But like when it talks like if you look in some of the Old Testament references to fornication, it's not talking about infidelity to your husband or wife. It's talking about infidelity to God. And so, what I think this is actually talking about is if a man is married to a wife and she fornicates, meaning she rejects God and just like abandons her testimony and the reason I think that in that's the one instance where Christ is like literally justifying divorce is because a woman, a mother especially, has so much influence on children. And if you as a husband cannot trust your wife to teach the values that you hold dear, and
Mm,
then now you are literally damning your children, your own children.
I
So
see.
that's what, and again, I'm not saying this authoritatively. This is the best understanding that I have come to yet, but I think it's worth considering, and it's something that very few people that I talk to have actually even noticed in many cases, let alone thought about or studied out and had an explanation for.
Well, and look, that would make sense too, because let's face it, if a woman or a man is throwing off the gospel,
Hmm.
screwing around is just a natural step in that process, right? Um,
It's rare that one doesn't accompany the other at some level.
right, and I want to be careful here that I'm not throwing everybody under the bus who's post-Mormon. There are fine people who are post-Mormon who are perfectly faithful to
Honorable.
their spouse, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
But I also know that there is a segment that like immediately jumps into swinging, right? I mean, and so those two things seem to go hand in hand, right?
Yeah.
And I think here what the Savior is saying, because I think we do have to remember it was a male dominated um society that they were living in. So a man when he divorces his wife, it's not like he's just kicking the kids out, right? He's taking a wife's child as well, right?
Yes,
And so
the
that is
children would
very
stay with the
serious.
man. Yeah, the
Yeah, that's
children would stay with
very
the man in
serious.
an ancient context for divorce. Yeah.
Right, and so that's very serious. So no, I like the interpretation. I think it holds some water there for sure.
So yeah, and I think that this is really important because it also says the very last clause of this of verse 32, Matthew 5. Christ says, "Whosoever shall marry her that is divorced also committeth adultery."
Mm,
Why would he say that? Could it be because if we just look at the etymology, the just a purely scholarly like linguistic analysis of the word adultery, and if we have the understanding that it comes from the word adulterate, in other words,
right,
introducing impurities, and when we have this perspective that marriage is a union between a man and a woman that permanently alters probably the man too, but specifically the woman. In particular, the woman is altered forever with this microchimerism, this genetic alteration that we now have the instruments and technology to observe in real life in our day.
right,
Like maybe that is what Christ is referring to is just it's actually a natural law, a physical reality, a
right.
biological thing, not just a spiritual thing.
Absolutely. And then not to mention that you might be messing with kind of God's order for the family as well, right?
Exactly.
And there's some far-reaching things here with this that I think are of an eternal consequence that sometimes I think people don't take into consideration when we start talking about this particular covenant.
Yeah. So let's talk briefly about so we've been talking about like the more natural or biological aspect. I mean, we've had conversations about other degrees of marriage as well, but let's specifically talk about Mormonism has a quite unique perspective of
Hmm.
marriage because we believe in a pre-mortal life where we had interactions with God. He was our father, and we were all brothers and sisters, like living together in the big mansion with the big man and mom and dad, and we had these loving bonds and all of this, like, and we believe that we were foreordained and made covenants and had relationships before we were born into this life, right?
Right.
Um, so when we talk about the law of chastity having is being faithful, fidelity to our marriage vows, Mormonism ups the ante a little bit
Yep.
because it's not just the marriage vows we make in this life.
Right.
We believe in eternal marriage, which goes forward and backward. In other words, we had covenants made premortally with certain individuals that we of course, can violate. We can, of course, abuse our agency and break those covenants that we made premortally. But hopefully, as Mormons, we're trying to not do that.
Right.
And so, like, we have, faithfulness to marriage covenants is far deeper. It's a far bigger equation in Mormonism than it is in any other belief system.
It's got eternal implications, right? And this is what I think sometimes is missed is this idea that there's no other religion that I know of where marriage becomes the kind of the standard, right? The bare minimum to reach the degree of exaltation we want to get to. And so because of that, as you said, you've upped the ante a little bit, right? And
Sure
you're
have.
going to be on the hook for what kind of marriage you also had, right? I think that's going to be there as well.
Yep. So yeah, and I think now I do want to kind of qualify this a little bit because some people like there's actually a bunch of New Agers that believe in soulmates, and I
Right.
want to address the so there's a difference between a soulmate as kind of New Agers would understand that term and what we as Mormons would say is a premortal covenant marriage type of a like
Okay.
marriage. And the nuance there is that in a in a soulmate situation, let's say you marry somebody and then 10 years into your marriage, you become completely, utterly convinced that a different person is the person that you are supposed we're supposed to marry. And they don't use these terms, but they that they made premortal covenants with.
Right.
Solution in New Ageism is to divorce that first spouse and marry the second one.
Right.
And I think First Corinthians chapter 7 is quite clear that, obviously Paul is, so the context, section 74 of the Doctrine and Covenants clarifies. So First Corinthians chapter 7 talks about certain things. In fact, you know what? I'm going to pull that up real quick because
Yeah.
we might as well. And it's just a good, it's related directly to this topic. So
We're
uh
here.
yes, First Corinthians chapter 7, starting in just verse 1. Now, this is something that Catholics and others have used to try to promote celibacy, because Paul literally says, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." At first glance, that kind of looks like Paul is saying you should be it's
Right.
you should be celibate. Now in verse 2, he says it's okay to get married, if you're going to avoid fornication. Like if you can't control yourself and you don't think you can handle celibacy, then you can have your own wife and let every woman have her own husband. And so, it sets this uh, tone that like celibacy is ideal and marriage would be like second best, but
Gotcha.
it's better than fornication, right?
Right.
That's the common perception. That's the common way that almost everybody in Christianity interprets these verses. But section 74 talks about the context. Like, because these epistles of Paul, uh, he was answering letters that the people of Corinth had written to him. So
Right.
the people of the Corinthians wrote a letter and they were asking Paul a bunch of questions. This is him responding to their questions. And we don't have what was sent to him. We only have Paul's reply in the scriptures.
Right.
But section 74 talks about how the context here is marriage between believers and non believers. In
In
other words, marriage outside of the covenant.
okay. All right. So in there he'd be saying something to the equivalent of, and correct me if I'm wrong here. If you can't find somebody in the covenant to avoid just screwing around, it's better for you to marry a woman outside the covenant. Is that
Actually, no. What he's
okay?
saying, yeah, I mean, maybe that is possible. But what I think he's saying here is that it may not be a sin to marry outside of the covenant, but as an apostle, Paul is giving advice very emphatically, but you really should be marrying inside the covenant for obvious reasons. It's very difficult for a woman to support her husband if he wants to give money to the church or to the poor or to build a temple, and she's like, "Wait, I wanted a boat."
Right.
You have it's really a better idea to marry somebody that shares your same values and priorities than to marry somebody uh, for other reasons. And so he's strongly endorsing marriage within the faith, marrying other fellow believers. But in this chapter, he talks about how if you find yourself married to a non-believer now, because some people were already married and then they hear the gospel and only one person in the marriage converts, becomes a believer, and the other person does not, and he's talking about Jews and versus Christians, and
Right.
because they were all Jews to begin with, but as Christianity was being preached, some of them would accept that and become the believers. So when the New Testament talks about believers, think Christians, and when it says non-believers, it could refer to like Greeks and Gentiles, but it's generally referring to Jews who are not.
Okay.
Um, and so he's basically saying if you're married to somebody that does not share your values, do not divorce them.
Right. Okay. Because he's
because
dealing with a lot of converts coming in at this point, right?
yes,
Oh, okay.
yeah, this is Paul, the great missionary, right?
Right. Yeah.
He's talking about these converts, and he's saying that you don't know if you're a believing spouse, or excuse me, if you're a believing man and your spouse is a non-believing woman, you don't know, but what you might sanctify your wife and convert her to become a believer.
Right.
And likewise, if you're a believing woman and your husband's a non-believing man, don't divorce him. You are married. Like it may not be godly, it may not be say celestial eternal marriage, but you are married. And we need to acknowledge that and respect those that fact. And because sometimes I see people in Mormonism kind of maybe excuse uh, a little bit of uh, partner swapping or upgrading or whatever you want to call it. It's basically divorce, right? Um,
Right.
and and it's the justification that's given is well, but it's because my other spouse wasn't faithful enough, and I just want a faithful like you can justify it however you want. But it's certainly against the counsel of the scriptures. Uh,
Right.
Here in First Corinthians chapter 7.
And that's going to be interesting because I think as fundamentalism continues to grow, I think we're going to be wrestling with those same questions,
Correct.
right?
And, and as a man, it is not our responsibility to just accept truth and even if we have to leave our family behind. No, it is my responsibility as a man to bring my wife along. And if she's
Absolutely.
not ready, it's okay to still study and to still believe things, but you cannot move.
Yep.
We have a responsibility to make sure that we bring our wives along with us on this journey.
And that's something that I have told a lot of guys, right? I've, had my fair share of guys going, Dave, I've read this, I'm converted to it, but my wife just won't come along. And I'm like, then don't come,
Yeah.
right? Because here's the thing.
Then work on that and then
Yes,
come.
yes, exactly.
Not saying don't come. I'm saying get your wife on the right page, on the right track, and then come.
Absolutely. Because look, I'm just going to tip my hand here to anyone out there thinking about this. I am not in the business of breaking up a family, right? And I think I think God's going to honor the man who stays by his spouse that he made covenants to, even at the expense of getting a jump on something, right? Um, and so if you're having to justify a divorce, and I want to be careful here too, right? Because everything's got an exception. But
Right.
as a general rule, you don't break up one family to go start another. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not getting behind that. And quite frankly, I just can't be part of it, right? I couldn't sleep at night.
Right.
And so, if you're a dude or a woman who's come to this stuff and you're having a hard time with your spouse, understand your first covenant in this situation is to that spouse, right? You have to honor that and you have to work through that,
Hmm.
however that looks in the end.
Exactly.
So,
So yeah, the uh I think I want to compare like the scriptures often compare kind of our baptismal covenants to
right.
marriage, to a marriage relationship. Like Christ is the bridegroom and the church is the bride. And so, we as the church would be the female and Christ is giving us the Holy Ghost and like giving us light and truth and healing us. Like Christ is definitely performing that masculine role in the relationship with us as the
Right.
member of the church. And we should be fulfilling our duties as a feminine. We need to. It's not our place to dictate to Christ what he should or shouldn't do. Like it's our place to to submit, to surrender.
Yep.
Like and we can have confidence that Christ is not going to give us bad direction. Like he's not going to lead us astray. He's not going to leave us comfortless. And so we can just have that understanding
Yep.
as well there. So yeah, Christ, that relationship. I want to talk about. This is, I believe it's an Isaiah chapter, but I'm more familiar with it in Second Nephi. I think it's chapter 6. Um, oh no, it's not chapter 6. Where is it? Oh, shoot. I guess I wasn't. I usually remember the verses pretty good. Uh, but it talks about a bill of divorcement. Okay, I have to do this. We can cut this out later, right, Dave?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, do a timestamp on this one because,
Yeah,
uh,
I got you.
sweet.
Why I don't go live? Because quite frankly, I say too much crap.
Oh, it's 7. Oh, there it is. It was right in front of me. I just missed it. I was all right. Okay. So in Second Nephi chapter 7, this is again speaking Isaiah. He's quoting Isaiah, and Isaiah is speaking messianically. In other words, as if he were Christ
Right.
speaking, and he's addressing Israel, right? And it says, "Yea," in chapter 7, verse 1, "Yea, for thus saith the Lord." I'll also compare Isaiah chapter 50. Have I put thee away, or have I cast thee off forever? For thus saith the Lord, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement? To whom have I put thee away? Or to which of my creditors have I sold you? Yea, to whom have I sold you? Behold, for your iniquities ye have sold yourselves, and for your transgressions is your mother put away.
Mm,
Wherefore, when I came, there was no man. When I called, yea, there was none to answer. Now, I I am not going to share any details, and I don't know if I even have a perfect recollection of some of the details here, but there's a friend of mine who shared a story with me many years ago that left a very deep mark on me, and was quite formative for me. And he had married a wife in the temple, and she sadly got in. Well, she had had like some injury or a car accident. I don't remember the details, but she needed painkillers during her recovery from surgery, and she became addicted.
mm,
And so she became a drug addict and was abusing them, and and after the doctors kind of realized what was going on, they cut her off, and you know she was pissed, and made things infinitely worse because she started going to the streets to,
right.
to get her supply, right? And you know, she's a mother. She's got a bunch of little kids,
Yeah.
and, and her husband is working his tail off to provide, because this was expensive, like the surgery, and it's expensive. And and meanwhile, she's basically non-functional as a mom, and the kids are kind of suffering from some neglect, and dad's trying to do everything in his power. And it got to the point where he had to tell her, "You have to leave. You can't come to our home unless you're able to get yourself cleaned up, in which case you're always welcome back." Well, so she left. She was pissed. Like, she got real upset at him, and was bitter, and went off and was gone for like 2, 3 years.
Right.
And you know, partying, drug, swinging, like very a lot of infidelity. And the dad would come home from a long day's work, uh, let the people that was helping take care of the kids while he was working, they would leave, and then he would, clean up all the dishes, get his kids put to bed, take care of stuff, and then prep everything for the next day, because, going to school. And um, and he shared that this verse, "When I came, there was no man. When I called, yea, there was none to answer." He described that experience of being alone, and having all of this responsibility and no one to help, no one to share it with, and the woman, the wife that he had covenanted and that she had covenanted to be there for him and be his helpmeet had abandoned them all. And that kind of got to me because that's how the Lord feels
Yeah.
when we play the harlot. And let's not deceive ourselves. That's what we're effing doing when
Yep.
we violate our baptismal covenants and do that. So let's take that a little bit more serious because that's something that we can relate to. It's more we can grasp it and comprehend it. Everybody knows
It evokes
how.
a visceral response, right?
Yeah. Oh, and I'll tell you, so the rest of the story, because it does have a happy ending. It's an amazing ending. And so, because basically what happened was 3 years later, guess who shows up on the front porch?
Oh boy.
But she is in tears and very apologetic, very, very humble, very repentant. And she apologizes for what she did to her husband and to their children. And she, by all appearances, was completely sincere about it. And so this man welcomed her back in the home.
Wow.
It took time.
Yeah.
It took her a few months. Like she had to go to rehab. I mean, she had been trying, and he helped her and supported her through that process. But at the end of the day, they're back together. Well, at least last I haven't talked with this individual in many years, but this that story changed my life because at the time I was questioning like my own worthiness. I mean, we all make stupid mistakes. We all do terrible things as we're going through this life. And I don't I I humbly and openly acknowledge my weakness, and I am far from perfect. In fact, it's embarrassing how stupid and weak I am at times. But uh, I sincerely wanted to come back, and this was something that I really wanted to do. And when my friend shared this story with me, I read this scripture. I was like, that's how God feels. When a girl that I thought was supposed to be my wife and that I wanted to be married to and she up and just abandons and fortunately I had not married her, thank goodness. But it was really hard for me to go through that betrayal and to kind of heal. But I made it, and these verses I can't tell you how much of an impact they've had on me personally, spiritually, and just my testimony and understanding of of the the magnanimous mercy of the Father and of the Son.
Right.
So yeah, that is the covenants that we make. And when we break them, God does not divorce us. Even in our worst moments, we can always come back.
Right.
Like you brought up, and it's important to note that damaged goods, that's not a thing in the restoration. Like you can come back. Repentance is real. The atonement is real. But it requires full and complete repentance. And there's, it's not easy, but like Christ said, my burden is easy, my yoke is light. It's a heck of a lot easier to do things Christ's way, repent, acknowledge our fault, and do better than it is to do things any other way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I want to be careful here how I word this.
Okay.
There are circumstances, right? I think abuse is one of those, as we talked about earlier, the fornication thing, right?
Yep.
I think that's a form of that, right? And I want to be clear. Staying in a marriage where you're beat up get out of there, right? We're not saying stick around with an abusive spouse, right?
No.
And so you got to get out of those circumstances. So I want to make that crystal clear. But let's also not mince words that as I look around society, by and large, most divorces that I find are divorces of convenience rather than ones where you're running to safety, right? And I tend to look at marriages like, look, if there's not divorce happening, if there's not massive dysfunction that can't be fixed, you got to stick that out, right? Especially if you got kids. You got to stick that out and you got to work through it. And I know it sucks, right? I've seen it, but I've also seen where people have stuck it out and managed to fix things. And so there's not a one size fits all here. These are going to be things that are going to be as unique to each individual as the individual themselves. But understand that these are heavy, heavy things we're dealing with. And as men, we have responsibilities, right? We make those covenants. We hold a woman's heart in our hands, and there are things that are required of us because of that.
And we will account for
Yes,
every tear that our
yes,
wife sheds because of us.
yes. So understand that going into it. Absolutely.
So while we're here, I do want to talk about during the Law of Chastity conversation. I think it's important to note it's, especially in the context of the covenants that we make in the temple as part of that endowment. It's not just fidelity to our spouse,
Right.
because like I mentioned, Christ, he uses the same analogy, and even Jehovah
Mhm.
in the Old Testament, he talks about my he's a polygamist. He's talking about how Israel is one wife and Jews and
Judah.
Judah is the other wife, and they've both gone whoring after the idols and the gods of
Right.
Babylon, right? And so like it's not just fidelity to our, you know, physical marriage relationship with our husband, between a husband and wife. It's also fidelity to God and
Yeah.
to every covenant that we make, whether it's baptism, endowment, law of chastity. Like that has far more. It's more far-reaching than I think a lot of us realize or think about.
Yeah.
So, um, and again, in a mortal, in like an earthly marriage, where what we're dealing with in our lives, uh, generally takes two to tango. Very, very rarely is one party like completely innocent, faultless, and just a pure 100% victim, and then the other is just this piece of crap, right?
Right.
Usually, there's a little bit of mutual fault, right?
Yep.
In most of our marriage conflicts and issues. Well, so we don't have that in our covenantal relationship with God. Like
Right.
it just doesn't apply, right? Because with Christ, it's never him that fails. It's always us that fails him, not the other way
Exactly.
around. And so we can have that confidence. Um, and trust, and we need to acknowledge, and we need to use the moments of clarity and humility, because they do come on us sometimes, a lot later for some people than others, but we need to take those moments of self honesty and analysis and think, where am I falling short? And so there's a scripture in, where was it, First Timothy. um Oh, that was actually, I don't know if we'll have time for that one tonight. It's a
Okay.
good idea, but we'll I'll go to that maybe if we have time later. But while we're kind of talking, this is to me the meat of the conversation. And so if I may, I'm just going to share a few points. Like living the law of chastity is so much more than just like abstaining from adultery
Right.
and or fornication.
Absolutely.
Because marriage, like, you could compare marriage, it's like a seed. Um, it's like a seed that you plant in the soil of a man and a woman's souls. And it it metaphorically, it requires constant water. Like you put a seed in the ground, you don't water it, not much is going to happen, except for maybe you'll kill the seed. Fertilizer, you got to prep the soil, you got to make sure there's the nutrients. You got to give it sunlight, you got to plant it at the right time so that it doesn't sprout early and then just get killed from the frost or too late and then it doesn't produce anything. You got to give it shelter from the hail or the frost depending on your climate. Um, and honestly, as a guy that loves gardening and I have a little bit of experience with it, you also need to nurture it. Like you need to kind of love your plants and want to
Right.
help them and rejoice when they do good and be sad when they struggle, right? This is to me a good metaphor for a marriage. Those of us who are hoping for a marriage that's going to last longer than just this life. Like if we're seriously thinking that we want an eternal and a celestial marriage, we must put forth not just like an additive extra, but an exponentially greater effort to build an eternal and celestial relationship on this, at least begin that path right now in
Yep.
this life. Because you can't put it off till you're older. You can't put it off till the kids grow up and you have more time or you can retire. Like you can't, that's not how it works.
No.
And you can't think that just because I don't commit adultery that I'm faithful to my wife. Like marriage, the relationship, it's much more about trust.
Yep.
Which is why, adultery, as we said, we talked about already, is the ultimate betrayal of trust. But even if you're not an adulterer, like trust, let's talk about trust for a minute. Like a wife, trust is much more than just trusting that your wife isn't going to cheat or your or husband, is going to
Right.
cheat. Trust is all about like from a woman's perspective, a wife has to feel safe to speak
Yep.
even the things that her husband doesn't want to hear. Like, because guaranteed there are things that men don't want to hear from their wives.
Right.
And the easy out is and what many women are, kind of praised as being good wives is they just keep their mouth shut.
Ah, gosh. See, and I struggle with
And
that.
they confuse that with being submissive.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because I mean, submission is an important thing is
Yeah, it
in
is.
in our
Yep.
relationship with God and our, with in everything. Like we need to submit, but it's not submitting to a man, it's submitting to truth. It's submitting to God. Like the covenants that we make in the temple are qualified.
Yep.
And like you were saying, don't stay in an abusive situation. Like that's not what Christ is requiring of us. It's not what we are advocating. Um, but we just need to be perhaps a little more honest with ourselves when trying if you're trying to make an excuse to divorce a person, it's probably not like it's kind of it's pretty clear. Like abuse is a situation where yeah, divorce is justified. But even when it's justified, it's ugly.
Yep.
There's consequences. Like, and there's people that I love and that are very closely, kind of extended family members where there was a situation where the husband provided. They had a comfortable life, nice things. They could travel, they went on vacations, like outwardly, and they were active in the church. So from most metrics, it looked like a great marriage, right? Very, very happy. And had a bunch of kids. The kids are all pretty well, mostly well behaved. Like seems like a pretty good situation, right? But come to and me, this is somebody that I had, you know, pretty regular interactions with, and I thought everything was fine, you know? And just as a man, it was just so sad to see this female that I, you know, that I'm close to, that I grew up around a lot, and uh, come to find out her husband was a piece of shit and had been really abusing her and her children for many years. But he was very manipulative,
Uh,
it was a covert narcissism is kind of one term that's been used to describe this type of behavior, where it's this guy uh, just basically putting on the face that makes everybody think he's a great guy, and but then very abusive and manipulative behind closed doors. And um, when it came down to it, there were, you know, that she suffered in silence for many years, and you know, she it was not a weak person, but she thought that she was keeping her covenants by submitting, by, you know, just biting her tongue, because, you know, he wasn't like hitting her. You know, it's one
right.
thing when somebody's, you know, putting marks and bruising and like that. Even some women don't leave that situation, but you know, that's a much easier discern situation to discern that, yeah, you should probably get up out of there. But when the wounds are unseen, when the hurt is emotional and even psychological, like there's some weird stuff going on in some of those things, some of those situations, and I just felt like I had failed her as a man in the family. And you know, but once it came to our attention that this was what was really going on, this was the situation, it became much easier to help her, to give her the help that she needed to support her and get out of that situation. And so like, yes, women do need to submit, but men, we need to police ourselves, and we need to be watching out for the women in our lives, to help make sure that they're not in that situation. And if we're not hitting our wife, that's great, but that's like a really low
That's
bar.
a low bar. Right.
You know, are you know, do you make her cry? That's
Right.
that's that's probably a good little metric right there to kind of gauge, like, and even more so, what isn't she telling you? Is she crying in secret and you're not even aware of it?
Right. Right. You know, and
And
boy,
so and so I don't want to get you know, too personal, but it is kind of a personal thing. But so, like, my wife and I had an awesome marriage. Like, we've had an awesome marriage. We just celebrated our 16th anniversary, and we love each other much more maturely now, but we've never not loved each other. Like, we've
right.
had a run. But I will say, I have to say that there have been years, way more than I'd like to admit, where I thought I had a great marriage, but it was because my wife wasn't telling me stuff.
Right.
And and you know, I would much rather she tell me stuff than not tell me stuff. But it doesn't mean I like hearing the stuff when she shares
Right.
it. And I think she knew that, and so she, thinking that she was being a good wife, was kind of burying some of those feelings, and like, but the reality is, like, that's not marriage. Like, or it's marriage, but that's not going to produce a celestial, eternal marriage relationship. You know, does that kind of make sense?
No, that makes total sense. And there's a lot here to unpack, right?
Yeah,
And I think we need to, because I think this is where the rubber meets the road on this, right?
yeah.
And I want to say this, right? We've all had arguments with our spouse, right? And sometimes tears are shed, right?
Unless
Now,
you got married last week, maybe you haven't yet.
unless it's last week, right? You're in that first 2, 3 months, you might be doing just fine. But at some point, most of us have had an argument with our spouse, right? where, maybe nobody was wrong, right? And that's taken me years to figure out. Is that sometimes nobody's wrong. Sometimes you guys are just a difference of opinion and trying to figure it all out, right?
Yeah.
And tears are shed there, right? I don't think those are the same kind of tears that the Lord is talking about.
No. Well,
Um,
and like, for my wife and I, we didn't argue like hardly at all for years. So I don't know, maybe our honeymoon lasted for years. I do feel very blessed. Like I I I am so blessed by to have the wife that I have. But it's also really interesting because like it wasn't until several years into our marriage that I kind of was feeling that there was something off. But I would like, hey, is everything okay? But a good wife doesn't complain. A good wife is just here to submit and support her husband. And it's like I had to learn as a husband how to not just build trust that she could come to me with problems and I could help her fix them. Like she had to be able to trust me that that to the point where um rather than if she confides something, if she observes an issue or complains about something, that I don't just get defensive, but I just listen and respond with humility and kindness and because as men, like it's natural, we want to uh, rather than take responsibility when we do stupid stuff, we want to make excuses or start pointing fingers and blaming. And so like to to the men listening, and I'm not I'm preaching to myself because like the wife must feel safe to speak things, even the things that a man doesn't want to hear. Likewise, a husband has to feel safe to be able to confide in his wife when he feels weak.
yeah.
Like like that's hard. And so like to the men listening, speaking to myself as well, have you cultivated this trust? Have you like just shut up and listened for change and then responded with the humility, the kindness, and not harshness or blame or making excuses? Um, and if you're just like, oh yeah, I don't do that. Like, are you sure? Because I thought I was too. And like, would you bet your exaltation on it? Or might it be worth doing some checking? Because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
You don't know what your wife isn't telling you if she's not telling you. And maybe there's nothing, but it can't hurt to check. And so like and if you don't do that already, I would encourage you to make that a part of your routine to just check in and just that humble counseling with your wife or wives if you're in a plural situation. And then once you've earned that trust, once you've extended that enough times and encouraged them to be able to open up and share even those difficult things, like then now
Yeah.
and when they come out, now you can actually repent and improve. And I tell you what, like as good as the honeymoon phase was, and if that's what it was, my honeymoon phase lasted for years and I loved it. But as good as that was, I wouldn't trade that for my marriage today
Yeah.
for $1 million. So, I think
I,
that I want to extend that invitation to any of the men listening. Um, if you've been married for 5 years or 50 years, like I think this is good counsel. You don't know what you don't know, and it's really important to find out.
I want to speak to this a little bit, right? Don't assume that just because you're sealed in the house of the Lord that everything's golden, right? We are told very on in that endowment process that if you are true and faithful to these covenants, these are the blessings. Okay? So let's look at, and I'm going to lump the ceiling in here with the law of chastity because I feel like they go hand in hand, obviously, right? If just because someone pronounces you now as one doesn't mean you're there, right? That's telling you where the goal is, and you got to go there. And I understand for dudes, vulnerability is a huge deal, right? Um, we we don't live in the world, and quite frankly, we're not most of us, right? I don't want to speak overall, but most of us aren't born with this innate desire to be overly sherry with our feelings, right? We're more
No.
like, bro, rub some dirt on that thing and get back in the game, right?
Right.
And there's a certain amount of that that is very healthy to the male psyche, right? Um,
And there's a time and a place. Like if people are shooting bullets at you and your family, like that's probably not the time to be getting in your feelings.
no, no. At that point, you should have one feeling, and that's
Yes.
extinguish the threat, right?
Yes.
And
Right.
and so that's there by design. Um, and we shouldn't shy away from that. But I can really resonate with what you're saying about being as married as long as you have been now. Amber and I celebrated 29 years in November, and Tanya and I just had our second wedding anniversary. Both of those women are my solace, right? At the end of the day, look, newsflash, I enjoy doing this podcast. I really do, but it is a time drain, right? And there are times where I just come to bed after work is done, after the podcast is done, I fielded the last phone call, I wrote the last email, and I just go to bed and I'm just done. Done, right? And there's times when I doubt, am I even making an impact? Should I keep doing this? I don't understand, right? And they're the ones there. And it has taken me a while to get to the point to where I can be vulnerable in front of my wives. But, but I'm there now. And like you were saying, it's so much better than the honeymoon phase, right? So much better. The other thing I'll say, I think it's important that we need to talk about submission a little bit, right? And what that looks like. Or at least how I think it should look like, right? And I'm not going to sit here and pretend to tell you that I'm a marriage counselor because I am not, right? I am not.
Yep.
Um,
We should put
but
that disclaimer in bold at the front,
yeah,
buddy.
let's put that in bold, right? Neither Taylor nor myself are marriage experts. But the whole reason I'm in Missouri now is because my wife felt comfortable enough to come up and voice it, right? Um, I was, I came out. I had a good experience here. I thought, yeah, maybe someday, maybe a year, right? And I drove back telling the girls that, let's give it a year. Let's let things cool off. Let's just make sure, right? I try to be very deliberate in these kinds of things.
Let's not
And
be too hasty and jump.
right,
Yeah.
right. And so I finish a podcast one night, and the girls must have been listening at the door because I no longer was like, bye everybody, and have a short 5 minute conversation and hit end. And there's a knock at the door, right? And you were in that old house. You know what room I'm talking about. So I let them in, and they both are just sitting there looking at me like, hey, we need to talk. And I thought, uh-oh. Um, and so they came and they said, hey, we need to get to Missouri sooner. And I'm like, I'm not gonna lie, there was a twinge, right? Of like, and look, probably 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, looking back on who I am, I probably would have dug my feet in a little more, right? I'd have been a little more defensive. I'd have been a little more whatever. But they said, this is what we've been feeling. And if you can just pray about it one more time, you know, get rid of all your plans, right? Not that they're not good plans, but get rid of your plans and honestly seek. Then we'll do whatever it is you feel is right here. And look, I'll be honest, I was less than happy with that. I was like, no, I've made this decision. We're good. But I hit my knees, prayed together as husband and wives, and then I prayed by myself. And dude, 2 days later, the answer just came. Yeah, now's the time. And so as I talk to the girls, everything falls into place, right? Everything. You know how quick that move came about. It
Oh yeah.
was it was shoo, just done, right? Now, I look back on that and I would have missed out on so many blessings had I just dug my heels in. I'd have missed out on so much, right? But because I chose to hear my wives out, and I thank God every day I did, because I understand that with who I am, there's a very real possibility I always choose wrong. And so
Right.
this one, this time I just happened to do it right, and we were blessed for it. So I want to say that this whole submission thing isn't just I'm the man now, be quiet and let me do my work, right? There's You're a fool if you don't listen to your spouse and hear out their concerns and whatever. And I'm not going to always promise that everyone's going to be happy with the decision and the outcome, immediately. But if you do those things and you work at it, right? And working's the hard part. There's a lot of blessings to be had there. And we're designed to make one another stronger, right? If we can manage our egos a little bit, check those at the door. And look, I'm mainly talking to the dudes here, mainly because I know where my ego needs to be checked frequently. Um, and just put that away because there is a beauty there. And if it breaks my heart thinking that there are marriages where you're not each other's solace, right? You're not each other's peace. Um, when all the chips are down, who is it you go to, right? I love my brethren. I love my brethren. But man, nothing compares sitting down and talking to either one or both of my wives, right? Um, just this last weekend, Tanya and I went out and celebrated our anniversary. And I just remember thinking, I just don't want this to end, right? I don't want to have to go back to the grind of work. I wanted to get back and see Amber and stuff, but I just didn't want to go back to the grind, right? In that moment, my marriage was my solace, and it was my peace. And I think that's what we got to get to. And as guys, I mean, we have to help foster that, right? Um, we got to be able to check our aggression at the door at times, and just leave that outside when we're dealing with our marriages, because I think it can do some damage if it's left unchecked, right? And certainly there is a place where the man has to make the call, right? That is what we're called to do, and so we have to do it, but that doesn't mean that you should do it at the expense of everything else.
Right. And I do want to say, because as men, we kind of have a little bit more experience on this side of the equation. But I've had many conversations with my wife, even preparing to come and talk about this on the podcast. And so I do want to just kind of do another invitation. So for any of the women that are listening, um, and so like because men like we're like the main thing is are our wives telling us what they actually feel? Like we need to cultivate the trust that they can tell us even the things that we don't want to hear. For the women, you want to be able to tell your husband, but sometimes women have a propensity, like women also have to cultivate trust.
Yeah.
And the way that a woman cultivates trust is very different because the woman must cultivate trust through showing respect, not like through showing love and respect, not criticizing, not criticism and shame
Yeah.
in his weakest moments. Like it's one thing for when a husband is, you know, on his A game, doing well. Then you can be supportive, right? But what about in his weakest moments? Um, like those are the moments when women can be very critical, can find fault. And I'm not saying that we don't deserve it.
Right.
But if you want your husband to communicate with you, you have to respond with without the criticism, the shame, the anger, the like and pointing the finger. Uh like because as a woman, like do you also withhold communication and then hold it against your husband when he doesn't meet your needs, like by reading your mind? Like this is a conversation, it's kind of a standing joke with my wife and me. Uh like, sweetie, I can tell you're upset. What's going on? And she'll share it, and I'm like, okay, well, what the I thought that the you didn't tell me that. Like, and she we kind of just laugh about it because she kind of expects me to read her mind sometimes and holds it against me if I don't. And this is not something that we're currently really dealing with. But it took us a while to kind of first off identify that was the source of kind of the lack of harmony and unity in the relationship. And then once we had identified it, like figuring out how to address it. So as a woman, look for opportunities to not criticize or find fault or shame a husband when he screws up, when he fails. Uh, don't expect him to read your mind. Men, we're pretty dumb. Like we're not good at reading your mind. And so if a woman is truly a helpmeet to your husband, like that's totally different than, because that's being there for him when he's vulnerable. When,
Hmm.
it's very different to just be a woman that like gave exclusive rights to your body and you produce children. Like that's not faithfulness. That's not, I mean, it's marriage, but it's a very much lower level
It's
of marriage.
shallow, right?
It's a shallow marriage. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And so, like, are again, like the men, I, we have the tendency to think, I don't do any of those things. Oh yeah, I do that. My wife trusts me. My wife tells me what she's thinking. Well, women, you might not want to identify any of these things in yourself. And so I just would ask you to consider, like, are you certain? And would you bet your exaltation on it? Because if your husband doesn't actually feel that from you, the respect, the love, then your marriage is going to end after this life. Like, mm, well, it's at serious risk of ending.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say, anything like that, but so it can't hurt to check. So isn't it worth doing some checking? Humbling ourselves, counseling, as women, counseling with your husbands and possibly sister wives. Like if there's a plural situation, it's more than just one other party in this marriage relationship. Like there's other people and all parties must be respected, all parties must be humble, all parties are involved in this effort of living the law of chastity. In other words, being faithful to our covenants, not just with our spouses, but also with the Lord. And we all have room to repent. And we can't just be doing that and giving it lip service. Like, even Joseph, remember there's a time that he says, search your hearts and see if you are like God. I have searched mine and I feel to repent of all my sins.
Yeah.
Now, if Joseph said that, and this was not when he was young,
Right.
he was pretty advanced. Like, I think this was Nauvoo. He probably was certainly in his mid late 30s. And like he accomplished so much by the age of 20, like it's just unfathomable for
Right.
most of us to even relate, right? And so, like if that's Joseph, that's an example of humility.
Yep.
And so if we if we know but don't do, we don't really know. Like, and we love to deceive ourselves and excuse ourselves, and we like to indulge in the illusion that we are doing well, that we are good people. But a man can be saved by no faster than he gains knowledge, right? Isn't that Doctrine and
Right.
Covenants? Certainly the teachings of Joseph.
Yep.
And that is true, but it's not an intellectual endeavor.
Right.
Like God doesn't care how smart we are or how many books we've read or how many scriptures we've memorized or our deep insights and wise conversations that we have. Like we that's not what God cares about. Even things like yes, doing all those things, being smart, having ideas, reading our scriptures, memorizing scriptures, having conversations, discussing, serving in the temple, all those things are good. Don't get me wrong, these are important and wonderful. They're tools designed to help us progress spiritually. What I'm trying to communicate is that the gospel is not a checklist.
Right.
It's not about what we do half as much as it's who we become as we're doing it.
Yep.
So you know, obviously do the things, but it's not about what we do. It's about
Yeah.
who we're. So, and it's not enough to talk about it, like and think that I'm doing good. Like we have to know. Like we have to be about it. We can't just talk about it. We got to be about it. Because, like I said, if we know but don't do, if we know but don't do, we don't really know. Um, if we learn but don't change, we haven't really learned. And the discussion is not about information, it's about transformation.
Right.
You know, the people that the ordinances, the priesthood, the individuals that administer them, those are really important. Don't get
Yeah.
me wrong. You need the ordinances. Christ himself was baptized and he was without sin. And so, like, if he needed it, we sure as you know what need it. But even if Christ himself performed a marriage, well, maybe Joseph. Let's make it a little bit, well, let's bring it down to maybe more our level. Even if Joseph himself performed a marriage sealing, that alone does not guarantee that it's going to be celestial or eternal.
Right.
You know, we got to cultivate the bonds, the attributes, the relationships. And in my experience, my very limited and but maybe more than some people's listening experience, like marriage is the best tool that God gives us to cultivate attributes
Yep.
that can help to become like him to. And so like the way and the other amazing thing about the ordinances and the laws, the covenants that we make in the temple and such is it's they instruct us. They tell us how to acquire these attributes. So they give us the spouse that will help us better than anything else to acquire these attributes. They they lay out the pattern. They show the way of how to do it in the ordinances themselves.
Right.
Because marriage must be it's much more than just a functional partnership.
Yeah.
It it should be romantic. Marriage should be an eternal romance.
Yep.
I mean, I I I look and I contemplate in my, spiritually equivalent of like an infant or maybe a toddler perspective, trying to comprehend father and mother. And they are deeply madly in love with one another. And they're just living out their eternity the way that they want. And they're it's a romance that they're just engaged with eternally. So anyway,
You
rant
know,
over. I wanted to go through some of those things because it takes both sides. It takes the men in a marriage and it takes the woman or the women in a marriage. It can't neither is the husband without the man or the wife nor the wife without the husband in the Lord. You know, the fullness of joy requires a union. And, the law of chastity is not just abstaining from adultery
No.
or even the higher law, abstaining from lust, which is much harder. It's much more advanced. But the law of chastity is about much more than that because being faithful to our covenants requires us to um, become gods. Like, I don't know how else to say that.
Right. Right.
Like we're not there till we're there. And so like if we're going to keep this law, if we're going to keep this covenant, the law of chastity, we got to make it to godhood.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah. No, couple things there, right? I think the goal is, all right, I'll make this a little personal here. I watched an older couple in in my family. Um, the husband died. They'd been married for 50 some years. And shortly thereafter, the wife passed as well. I mean, really shortly thereafter, just over a month. And she was perfectly healthy before that. And this is going to sound kind of bad. And so you got to hear me out. I want that kind of a marriage with both my wives, right? Where you die of old age and one just can't live without the other. I think at that point you have achieved a certain unity and oneness that I think that covenant is really designed to do, right?
mm,
To make you one with your spouse, with your wife and or wives, right? And you don't get there by happenstance. You don't get there by accident. I don't care who you are. You get there through work, right? And you just talked about romance, and I agree with you 100%. But I also want to say that life doesn't always isn't always conducive to that, right?
sure.
And
And
that's
the
going to
romance is different from a fairy tale. Sometimes the
exactly. Thank you.
romance, sometimes you're up to your ankles in mud, but it can still be romantic. Like
Yes.
romance, in classical music, the romantic period isn't like just about love songs and like, the living happily ever after. It's about the bold adventures. Like you listen to romantic period of classical music and it's exciting. It's pushing into the unknown. It's if it makes you feel something that is noble and it inspires us to greatness and to courage. Like that's what yes, lovey-dovey chick flick romance. Like I think that still applies in a marriage too, personally, but
I do.
that's not all that it is. Like
Right.
the romantic aspect is we are literally engaged in the most epic adventure story of our lives.
Absolutely.
And we have the best partner, we got a ride or die on our
Yep.
at our side.
Yep.
That's what marriage should be.
I remember when I knew, like, I knew Tanya was supposed to be in the family without a shadow of a doubt, right? The
Mm.
moment we were, even before we got married. But every once in a while, the Lord absolutely sends like little confirmations, I think, right?
Yeah.
And Amber's used to it, right? But I mean, because like, look, I did my share of moving around, right? Chasing the dollar, right? Moved from Boise to Maryland, from Maryland back to Boise to adopt a set of twins, right? We've been through it. And we're getting, we got snowed in Wyoming on our way out here to Utah for just, I mean, to Missouri for just a couple hours. Could have been way worse, right? And that's a miracle in and of itself that involved prayer and stuff. But I remember, and I don't even know if she remembers saying this, but I was frustrated and irritated, and I kind of walked out of the hotel room, and it's like January, late January, early February, and the wind is whipping sideways through Wyoming, and I'm just watching the snowdrifts pile up, and I'm just pissed off, right? I'm like, and again, I don't know if she even remembers this, but she just came out, Tanya came out and she just put her hand on my shoulder and she goes, think about the story we get to tell about this after we're done, though. Right. And I'm like, all right, that's a very Sanders thing to say. Right. It really is. Right.
Good
And
point.
yeah,
Touche.
yeah. Point taken. Right. Um, and that was one of those confirmations like, yeah, it probably is par for the course with me. Right. Um, but yeah, it's just it. And look, I want to say this too. Right. These kind of marriages can and should exist plurally as well as through monogamy. Right. Takes work, but it can absolutely be done. Um, I'm by no means perfect yet. I mean, phew, there's times I think, man, it's a rough chore being married to me, right? I understand or I at least try to understand what it's like to be married to me. The phone rings constantly, something's always going on, but those women just take it in stride, and like I said, are my solace. And for men, I think chastity looks like guarding that heart, right? Of your spouse. You are a bulldog at the door, right? And you gotta have each other's backs. Um, I remember I've married two couples in my life. And I remember one of those I had I had told this young couple, from here on out, it's you two against the world. I'm not saying abandon your parents or abandon your family, but understand that you are each other's priority now. And as men, we have to guard their heart like a bulldog, right? And sometimes even from ourselves. When we're most irritated, when we're most angry, when we're most upset. Look, you'll never meet a guy who is as flawed as what I am. And there's certain things I know I have to do to mitigate some of the natural aggression there, right? I gotta lift weights. I gotta go hang with the fellas, you know, and my girls, my wives, they're just heaven sent because they know me, they understand me. And when you get to that point to where you can be vulnerable in front of each other and have uncomfortable conversations, or sometimes just disagree and still stick together until you do find agreement and unity. That's a beautiful place to be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely a beautiful and it is like you said, as much as the honeymoon period is amazing, the depth of the relationships that I have now, I wouldn't trade those for the world. It's a more mature love, and it
and it does
is
and it doesn't happen on accident. Like
no,
it's not something. It's aging does not mean growth. Like you could be
right.
married for 50 years and never get get into that. And so it takes conscious effort and labor, and both people need to be. And you brought up polygamy. I do want to just really briefly talk about, because some people would say, well, how can a man be faithful to his first wife and take a second? And I get it. Like it does seem hard to understand for folks. But this, if nothing else, let this satisfy our minds about what's actually the higher law. Is it easier to balance a relationship between one man and one woman, or multiple women and a man? Like, it is in like exponentially more difficult to do this right. And that's why I think that we shouldn't just be, I'm not condemning anybody who lives polygamy. Like there's people in Africa, there's people like Native Americans historically, like this it's actually the norm societally throughout history of civilization. This forced monogamy thing is kind of more of a recent innovation, you could say. Um, but I'm hesitant. So while I'm not willing to criticize or find fault with African tribes or anybody that's living polygamy, like as Mormons, it's not just and oh, I guess that's one other thing. Especially I've seen in certain fundamentalist circles a tendency to kind of equate the more wives you have, like the more faithful you are, or the more righteous you are, or like there's not an inferiority or superior. Marriage is marriage.
Hmm.
And so polygamists are not superior to monogamous. Monogamists are not superior to polygamists. They're both marriage. And I've
Yep.
had conversation with some friends like, if you're the parent of one child, you're a parent. If you're the
Yep.
parent of 10 children, you're still a parent. And like I think that we as fundamentalists sometimes make far too much of a deal about distinct making the distinction between
Right.
one wife versus multiple wives. And so like let's stop doing that and let's focus on, because at best it becomes distracting. Let's focus
Yep.
on the the quality, not the quantity
Yep.
of our um and so like how what else you were saying you were talking there was another thought I was trying to finish up. I do want to talk about one other thing, which is that I was having a conversation with my brother-in-law, who you know well, Justin, and we were talking about um, the curse. And this is part of the temple, but it's right there in Genesis, like
Hmm.
Adam and Eve, and this curse that's described. And so, of course, they have different curses. In Adam's, or well, let's start with Eve because that's the order it is. Eve is cursed with a pronouncement that her desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee, right? Over her. So that's kind of bleak, right?
Right.
As a woman, that's seems kind of harsh. And what Justin and I, the insight that we had was, and I can't remember, I think he had been reading a book that was exploring some of these ideas. And the insight was that this was the natural state. In other words, like
Mm.
if it's not like God is condemning Eve, women, that your desire will be to your husband and he's going to rule over you. He's saying it's a warning. Like it's not what's right. It's not what should happen. It's what will naturally devolve. Women will naturally uh have a propensity to marry a man that's going to rule over her, and she's going to be enslaved to her emotions, essentially, right? She's going to her desires shall like I guess the word that many might be familiar with is like codependent. How many codependent women do we know? They're all over the place, right? And codependent just simply means, if you're not familiar with that term, that you can't be happy if your husband does this or that. He has to do certain things. And if he doesn't, then you're miserable. Like that's what a codependent relationship would be, is that your happiness is contingent upon the actions of someone else. And that's very unempowering. Like you're just signing up for misery if you get into that. And so many of the worldly marriages that are very easy to observe, that's kind of what it is. Women
Right.
aren't. So women are not to be ruled over, like we talked about. Women are to submit, because like there's nowhere do men covenant to rule over their wives.
Nope.
Sorry, that's not in the thing. What we do covenant to is to receive our wives, and our wives do covenant to submit to the husbands, but it's qualified. It's contingent upon the husband submitting to God and obeying correct principles. And if your husband is not obeying correct principles and submitting to God, you don't have a covenantal obligation to submit
Right.
to him. So, and then on the men's side, like Adam's curse, to deal with thorns and weeds, thistles, briars, and noxious weeds. And in Genesis account, it says a little bit more. It kind of piles it on, that afflict and torment him. So again, is that do we believe in a do I believe like I'll just ask for myself. I don't believe in a God, a punitive God that's just up there in heaven, like with his with his paddle ready for
Right.
us to mess up so he can smack us. And he's not a vengeful God. So I do not believe that this is like a punitive sentencing. This is a warning. This is the natural consequence. And for men, we must not, through our neglect and because it's natural, like men, especially in gardening, there's a natural propensity to kind of be lazy and
Right.
neglect. And so we got to get over this propensity to be lazy and to like let things go. As a gardener, I would be a pretty poor gardener if my yard was full of weeds and
Right.
thought thistles and all that stuff, right? And so this is something that men must guard against. And because like again, we don't covenant to rule over our wife. We have to earn the trust and respect
Yeah.
that of our wives. And like as the scripture says, Christ, men, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and laid down his life for it.
Yep.
So, like if we had to take a bullet for our families, we would.
Yep.
But dying for our families is in many ways far easier than living for our families because you take the bullet once and you did it. You're like,
Right.
okay, you're a
Right.
hero, right? But living for our families, we that is as men, that is the responsibility that we have. Um, and so there's one last little thing I want to say about just since you brought in the ceiling aspect. Uh, I think this goes hand in glove. A man must earn the trust and affection of his wives by a lifetime of love, service, and honor. At the judgment bar, wives will be the expert witnesses, either for or against their husband.
Yep.
A man cannot become an heir of God without a woman who accepts him as her God. And the reason plural wives is an eternal necessity for godhood is because the law of witnesses requires at least two or three for every word to be established.
Ooh.
So, because I do not believe that you have to live polygamy in this life or you're,
Right.
SOL. But I do believe it is an eternal principle and it is an essential, like, we need to be willing in this life. We don't have to
Yep.
necessarily live it in this life unless God commands it, in which case, absolutely, we have to live it in this life, right? Uh, but it is an eternal principle and it is a requirement for eternity in the eternities for godhood because of the law of witnesses.
Yep. Yep. I've heard that before. I want to touch just for a second on the gardening aspect that you just brought in.
Mhm.
Those thorns, thistles, and noxious weeds. If a dude is left to himself, he's going to develop those.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. As guys, we will absolutely develop really poor habits that don't lead us anywhere except misery, right? But like a garden, if we tend to that, if we root those things out, they may come back from time to time, but once you subdue it and you got a handle on it, it gets easier to spot. They stick out a little more, and I think it's part of that, right? It's amazing to me that a lot of the covenants that we take in the temple, and even the oath of vengeance, is in some ways a civilizing principle, right? It's you're no longer seeking warlord type, clannish Hatfield and McCoy's vengeance. You're just going to turn it over to God and let God deal with it,
Yeah.
right? And so likewise, um, when with these principles that we're taught in the gospel, and especially the covenants we make, they're designed to help us be more than the natural man, right? And root out some of those things. So while definitely, it does allude to a man going out and making his way in life, right? And supporting his family. I think it's also talking about the spiritual aspect, your spiritual thorns and thistles, your spiritual noxious weed, or maybe if you were to talk to my wife, my obnoxious weeds. Um, you've you've got to root those things out. You've got to tame it and bring it into to under control, right?
Oh,
Um, or else you're forever suffering.
yeah.
So,
But yeah, like what man is going to go to tons of effort to like grow food and have a productive if he doesn't have a family? Like it's rare. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's pretty rare. Like
oh, dude, dude, my wife,
most men would just sit on the couch, eat Doritos, and watch football if they.
dude, dude. Okay, so I'm gonna share a story here, and this was one before Tanya came into the family. My oldest daughter had just had her first baby. Amber went up plenty early because it was during COVID, and she was worried about not being able to be there and that sort of thing. So I was like, "Look, everybody's healthy now. Just get up there. I'll be up there in 4 weeks behind you." Right. So for 4 weeks, it was me, my two younger boys, and my middle daughter at home. And all of a sudden, I get this message from Amber saying, I need to go grocery shopping, but I need to do a better job. Well, my daughter had taken a picture of the fridge, and all that's in the fridge is like steak, eggs, low calorie Gatorade, and that's about it, right? And I'm like, I'm not seeing the problem, right? Now,
Yeah,
truth be told, the kitchen table was full of gun oil, right? And protein powder and all my stuff for the gym, all my supplements, right?
right.
And like it made me think like if I was left to my own devices, I wouldn't have nice furniture. I'd have like cinder blocks and plywood with a few pillows to make it
Yeah,
comfortable, right? As long as I had ESPN and I'm good. Um,
right.
but that's not a complete man, right?
No,
That's not a whole person.
living
And
far
so,
below your potential, your privileges, and
yeah,
you're not filling the measure of your creation. We were meant for more than that.
I always find it interesting that when Isaac sends out a bride to find a bride for I think it's Jacob. Is it Jacob?
Huh? Jacob and Rachel. No, it's more like I think Abraham sends out the servant to find a bride for Isaac. I think that's
Okay, that's what I'm thinking. You get the feeling like Isaac's not doing a whole bunch, right? Like
right.
if you read that, like it's almost like Isaac's just chilling in his dad's tent, right?
Yeah,
And it's not until he gets a wife that all of a sudden Isaac's like, "Oh, I better get up and I better do something," right?
right.
And that's healthy. That's good. That's part of that growing process, that maturation, right? And as he faced some of the same things his father did or different challenges, I'm sure he looked back at the marriage he had with Sarah and possibly his other wives and went, "Oh, that's how that's done," right? Um, there's beauty in the journey too. That's the other thing I'll tell people.
100.
Dude, I look back at all the fights, all the disagreements, and we still stuck it out. And we laugh about them now, right? And we watch our kids go through it. And
Yeah,
we're like, I remember I told my oldest boy, yeah, it sucks in the moment, but don't just rush through this, right? There's good times to be had here. Um, Marriage is ultimately designed to bring us joy, right? And if it's not bringing us joy, we're doing it wrong. There's few things I'll ever say concretely because, quite frankly, I just don't know enough to speak that concretely. But I will say this: if marriage isn't bringing you joy, you're doing it wrong. Um, I wouldn't trade the time I've spent with either of my wives for anything in the world. And as much as I feel a responsibility to this podcast and all my other responsibilities, they come first, always and forever. And that's really where my joy is at. Um, and I think we have to, if if as fundamentalists we are trying to show that these can be happy, healthy relationships, whether they be monogamous or polygamous, we have got to have happy and healthy relationships. They can't just be ones where we're saddled together.
Yes.
So, dude, anything else you wanted to cover?
Well, we're kind of into it. There is one other thing,
Yeah.
since we're talking about the law of chastity, and in Mormon culture in particular, I mean, this is not unique. It's not it's not only Mormons that deal with this. It's kind of common, but it is very prevalent in Mormonism. And since we're talking about the law of chastity, I think we might as well cover it. Uh, Modesty.
Okay.
You can cut this later if it's too controversial.
No,
But
you're good.
so there's no scriptures anywhere that talk about modesty or that command modesty. And that's kind of strange. Well, I guess I'd need to qualify that. So I'm going to share my screen because going back to this, um, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 is is it does use the word modesty. And so you can go through, there's various translations. The NIV, I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves, not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes. New Living English, King James, I wanted to, in like manner also, that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. And so, like, the there's various other translations. This is Bible Hub, which is kind of like it has the Strong's Concordance and it has the source
Mhm.
Greek in here. And so this is the Greek likewise, and then it just goes word by word. And what it says is it doesn't actually say modest. As if you can see the screen right here, it says kosmio, which is respectable, is a better translation. Now, the
Yeah.
English translators, the King James people and folk, they chose, and it's not like modesty is a bad choice, right?
Right.
But we've culturally built up an entire tradition and culture that if your sleeves don't cover the shoulder, or if we just create kind of essentially pharisaical standards of dress. And I welcome if anybody listening to this can find any scriptures that do command actual modesty, and it specifies, like, to the wrists sleeves or to the ankles, or all that. Like, certainly if we're wearing certain clothing,
Right.
uh, there's certain patterns that are cut that that I think, to preserve the sacredness of the symbolism of that type of clothing in a ceremonial setting, like temple clothing, and when kind of administering or officiating in certain ordinances, like in that context, absolutely, there is a standard because of a specific type of clothing. But outside of that setting, there are no scriptures. There's no actual proof that this is something that the Lord requires
Right.
to keep those such, X number of square inches of skin must be covered on the human body. Like, that's not there. And you know, the reason I think that this is kind of important is we traditions can be a good thing.
Mm.
And but traditions can also get in the way of doing what's best and what's right. And I guess just briefly, one other thing to just point out is when the angel Moroni appeared to Joseph in his bedroom. You remember what he was wearing?
Yeah, it was a kind of a tunic, right, that came down to just past the elbows, I think is what Joseph said, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong on that.
Yep.
and just above the ankles, if I remember. But I could be wrong.
And also the front was open so that he could see his breast. It says I could see into his bosom.
Right.
And so I guess just I don't want to be I know this is controversial, and this is something especially amongst fundamentalists and even mainstream LDS, like modesty is so like it's a sacred cow in many cases. And I'm not trying to offend anybody, so I'm, that is not my intention here. But I think it is quite interesting to make some of these observations. And if anybody listening can find a scripture that does command modesty and defines it as not respectability and modesty as in oh, this is the idos, modesty, modesty or awe, but it's talking about the oh, you know what? I didn't scroll down far enough, Dave. So it does have this Greek word for eidos, um, and it talks about it being discreet, shamefacedness, self-control. But again, it's more of about not the number of square inches of skin that's being covered. It's more about the attitude or the spirit in which the clothing is being worn.
Right.
So, um, and it also talks about basically if we're going to take that hardline stance, I guess we shouldn't ever wear jewelry or braid our hair or you know
Right.
all of these or everything needs to be cheap. So I do want to just submit for consideration the possibility that maybe we should be more concerned with our demeanor and the spirit with which we conduct ourselves than the number of square inches of skin that are covered or not. So,
You know, I think there's so much that goes into modesty, right? And I do believe it's like you were saying, more than just what how many square inches are covered. Certainly within Mormonism, when you do take on yourself certain covenants in the temple, there is the garment, right? And it should remain covered, I think, right? But at the same time, if somebody's out working in the garden and they roll up their sleeves and you're offended by that, that may be a you problem. Um, and it needs to be checked, right? Because look, I have seen where people got really judgy. I remember I was still in the LDS church, and we were having a leadership meeting, and um, I walked in, and there was a few people. I won't even name the callings because I don't want to tip anybody off. But they basically said, "Oh, I don't think Sister so and so was wearing her garments," and someone looked at me when they said that, and I'm like, you know what? Their underwear is not my concern. Um, not not here, not now, and hopefully not ever, right? And so that's between them and God, and I'm going to leave it right there. Those are things that I am like, the family has to answer to God on that. The individual has to answer to God on that, and I'm just not going to jump into it, right? Because what I might consider modest, somebody else could say I overdo it, right? And so I just leave it to each person's discretion. Um,
mhm.
but yeah, I'm not into, being the underwear police. I have no desire. Um,
Right. Well, and just the focus, because when we define modesty as certain types of clothing and covering certain, certain parts of the skin that can't be see the light of day and have to be always covered, it breeds a culture of outward focus
yep,
rather than the inward commitment. And so I think that is important because, like, yes, there are ways to break the law of chastity outwardly, but there's also ways to break it inwardly. And you can't
absolutely.
see those and we're very imperfect judges, like you were just saying about like the choices that people make. And so I just want to I guess encourage us to focus more on the heart than the outward appearances.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree. And just give each other grace, right? This thing's hard enough without having people pile on or talk junk behind somebody else's back.
Yep.
Just worry about yourselves in that department, and everything else I think will fall into place. But I mean, certainly I'm not a guy, look, I'll be the first one to admit I'm not a guy who wears my garments when I go to the gym,
Mhm.
right? In some ways I feel it would be disrespectful because I sweat like a stuck pig when I work out. So don't want to defile those that way, and just use the spirit. The Lord will let you know
Yeah.
what you should do in those situations. Don't look for someone to police that, because people have been all too happy to do that for you.
Yeah.
So,
And like I say, traditions can be good things, and especially when they're sincere, but as the Pharisees so amply demonstrated, they can also cause tons of problems.
absolutely, absolutely.
There's a few other things I wanted to kind of touch on with regard to the premortal covenants and agency.
Okay.
Because, I will say this, premortal covenants, uh, as far as marriage goes, I think we, I think there is a pretty good scriptural case, but I don't know if it applies to every single person. Like, there's a lot of people who probably don't care about the gospel. I don't know if God would have imposed it on people that were just more interested in kind of having a good time and having some experiences and having fun. I do think though that there are certainly instances like the scriptures, Alma chapter 13, Abraham, it talks about like high priests ordained before the foundation of the world and like the noble and great ones, right?
Hmm.
And one thing that I believe that I think we know is that if you don't know, then this is education for you. But there are certain that the fullness of the priesthood cannot be held by a single man,
Right.
individual. And so I think that there had to have been certain, maybe it's not every single person, but at least some were foreordained and received the priesthood before this life and all of that. And so when those types of situations are in play, it is important to, find the person that you made those covenants with. But I do want to kind of temper that because it needs to be qualified. And the reason I say that is there's people that I know that I go to church with and that have talked about how that doctrine kind of stressed them out. As a teenager, they're
Mm,
like, "Oh shoot, who am I supposed to marry?" And it became a super emphasized thing. And so I want to kind of temper that and just say, look, what we need to seek is not necessarily like the person that you made covenants with. I mean, if you did, then pray for Heavenly Father to give you that guidance and inspiration to find that person. But since I don't want to like make a definitive statement and say that every single person had those premortal covenants made. Um but here's the thing, even if they did, they're
right.
not unconditional.
Right.
Know, there's agency. God's not going to take away our agency. If say a young man or a premortal male spirit and a premortal female spirit, even if they did make a covenant before this life, uh, you know, if the young man after he's born and he's in mortality chooses a different path, that female spirit that if presuming she made premortal covenants with him, she's not like stuck with him.
No.
God's not gonna force her to be with this, dummy or this person who has chosen a different path. It's not a consignment. It's not like a sentencing of okay, this is your fate. Now you're stuck with him. And so like the same thing would apply for a young female. Like if a young woman comes to this world and chooses a different path, the young man is not stuck and bound to her, no matter what. So
Right.
that's what I really wanted to qualify that. And because of agency, I think this is yet another good case for why plural marriage makes sense as an eternal principle and as just a practical way to help reconcile the fact of agency with the infinite foreknowledge and plan of God. And that is, uh, I mean, just on average, Dave, do you think that generally speaking, young women or young men leave the church or abandon their faith more frequently?
I'd have to say young men, but I'm willing to be wrong there.
I would definitely say young men. You go to, especially in an LDS. So that's my background. I went to the singles ward. Dude, like singles wards in the LDS church, it's like predominantly female. Like
Right.
probably the three girls per guy that's active. And you know, you could hypothesize, you could speculate on why that might or might not be, but I think that regardless of cause and effect, like that is just kind of how it is. And so when perhaps inevitably more young men choose a different path than the young women, and their spiritual partners are left without, these young women are left without a male partner that they had made premortal covenants with. To me, that again provides for these daughters of God, these young women, by providing for, if because every good woman that wants to be married to a good man, if there's less good men around to go around than good women, then either God is partial and giving preference to certain of his daughters over others, or plural marriage just solves it all. So,
Right. You hit on a couple of important things there, right? One
yeah.
of them is this. And I think this is where it becomes super important to understand the difference between predestination and preordination, right? Preordination means yes, you were chosen to do this thing, right? But that doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? That means you still have agency. It's up to you to fill those covenants. Now, having said that, predestination says no, this is going to happen regardless, no matter what. where
Right.
where Mormonism relies heavily upon free agency, the ability to choose, this idea that you're just saddled with somebody despite them being a dirtbag or whatever, just doesn't hold water inside Mormon
Right.
theology. The To your point about there being more women than men in uh, you know that keep their faith. There was just an article here a few years back from, I want to say it was either the Tribune or Deseret News, that was basically talking about the fact that women have less marrying opportunities today in the church than what it used to. That there was already predominantly more active women than active men in
Yeah.
the church, which subsequently, and not my words, the words of a member of a stake presidency, and also a member, someone who was high up in Bonneville Communications,
Mm.
explained to me that's why they changed that one covenant in the temple, right, between husband and wife. Because, for the first time ever, there was more single people than married people in the church. And so I'm like, okay, but maybe ask the question of why they're not marrying and resolve that rather than try to change the covenant. But regardless, I think we're already there, Taylor.
Or stop forbidding plural marriage. I mean,
Right.
I don't have the reference right off the top of my head, but in the New Testament, I want to say Corinthians, Paul is talking about in the last days there shall be, all of these terrible things and forbidding to marry. So that is on the table there. Unfortunately, I don't really have high hopes that the church will seriously consider that as an option, even though I think you and I would agree they should for sure. But
Absolutely.
so going back to this concept of foreordained or pre-mortal covenants for marriage, um, I also want to say that yes, people can make mistakes, but they can be repented of. So like say a young man goes off the path, but then sincerely repents. Like imagine like an Alma the Younger type of a conversion story, right?
Right.
So he gets to that point, where he's sincerely repenting and wants to change, like God's not going to just say, okay, well, you had your chance and it's over. Like, no, he's going to give an opportunity. Now, it may be different. Say the young woman that he had made premortal covenants with, if he took until his late 20s, 30s to kind of pull his head out of the sand and figure it out, like she may have had legitimate revelation to marry some other guy, some
Right.
other good, if she didn't have that detour. But just because people have a detour doesn't mean that they're like screwed forever. Like I want to bring in, and so for perhaps rather than focusing on necessarily like foreordained or premortal covenants for marriage, the best way to maybe just bridge this is to say we believe and we need to focus and emphasize, especially for young people, revelation. Marriage decisions should be guided by revelation.
Yep.
And sometimes in an ideal situation, people that made covenants premortally stay on the path and they find each other and God brings them together in this life and they choose each other, they exercise their agency and all those principles are respected, and then they do it. They get married, and and like that's to me the ideal. But it's not something that if you get off track, again, you're not damaged goods. Like all of us can repent, and until we're dead, like literally, we have the opportunity to repent every day
Yep.
until we don't breathe and our eyes close forever. So I just want to apply that and just, qualify that quite a bit more. Also, I wanted to, while we're talking about agency, let's talk about agency after marriage.
Okay.
You know,
Give me just a second here, because there's one other
yeah,
thing I want to bring out here. Because like you, I've heard this from some of our younger members of the Mormon fundamentalist community here.
right.
This idea of, oh, I gotta get this right. I gotta make sure it's the person I made covenants with in the pre-existence. Relax. Relax, right? Like you'll know when it's the right person. God will let you know. Don't do not get your grip on too tight about this, or you're going to miss the magic of this moment, right? Just relax, enjoy the process, and God will tell you who the right person is.
And whether it's the right person that you made premarital covenants with, or if agency has basically rearrange things and God's will is a different. The important thing is to get revelation and do the right thing.
Yes.
Marry the right person for
Yes.
for the right reasons.
The right person is the one the Lord tells you to marry.
100%.
Right? That should be the don't worry about all of the pre-existent stuff necessarily, right? If it is that person, you'll know.
Yep.
If you don't, you probably won't, because God will tell you otherwise. So it shouldn't even just don't miss the magic of the moment, right? I guess
Yeah.
is what I'm saying, right? And relax and have a little bit of fun. You'll be all right.
Great point. I agree 100%. So I do want to qualify here. I do want to cover real quick, even in situations after a marriage has taken place. So say people get married and they get revelation. Say maybe it was ideal. Maybe this is the person they made premortal covenants with, and it worked out. All the agency was respected, and they get married in the temple, performed the sealing by the proper authority. Like you couldn't ask for a more perfect storybook ending to this magic. What happens if 10 years in, the husband or wife says, I'm done, and they go off the path and they abandon the marriage or the family or they break their covenants, whatever the case may be. Abuse could, situations can happen where there's abuse. Like that is the point at which we need to also respect agency.
Right.
Because even though you may start on the right path and you may marry the right person, does not mean that you are bound to that person no matter what. Now, I think like we were talking about with the First Corinthians chapter from Paul, if somebody, especially in a conversion, like if you're a convert, situation, like if somebody starts off as a Catholic, and then they join the Mormon, and then they gain a testimony of the Restoration and become a fundamentalist. But they married a Catholic in the Catholic Church, and their spouse isn't coming along on this ride to Mormonism. That's okay. That you don't divorce that spouse simply because they didn't convert with you. Um, and so like that's another thing. But uh, we also need to give people allowances
Right.
when allowances must be made. I think I'm poorly paraphrasing a statement that Joseph made. There can be no there can be made no allowances for sin, but since men sin, allowances must be made. I think that's about pretty close to the
Sure.
quote. And agency, especially when you're dealing with two different people, because we can control, within for the most part ourselves.
Right.
Uh, but we can't control other people, and we need to be respectful of those agencies and that decision. And I want to maybe cover a Brigham Young sermon. And this is kind of interesting because this sermon, I've actually heard it quoted very little. Um, it's from, in fact, when he gave the sermon, he told George Watt to record it, but not to publish it. So this was actually not published during Brigham's
Interesting.
lifetime, at least that I'm aware of. And you can find it. The place I found it, it was in one of Ogden Kraut's books on, I think, like celestial marriage. But anyway, uh, we're I'll skip through some of it, but I do want to cover some of this because um, I've also actually heard people who are aware of it abuse it. So let's take it all in context and kind of explore it. So he says some years ago, he brings up Adam God doctrine, and he's like, people are rejecting it, if and it's because of me. It kind of sounds like he's a little uh miffed that people, if Joseph had taught this, they would have accepted it, but since I taught it, they're rejecting Adam God doctrine
Right.
or having a harder time with it. Um, but anyway, so he dives in right here. We are continually sealing women to men and continually giving divorces. I now inform every one of my sisters that when they come to get a divorce, paying me $10 for it, you may just as well tear off a piece of your shirt tail and lay it by and call it a divorce, so far as any good that piece of paper will do you. It's kind of a crude manner of,
Hmm.
but basically, he's trying to make the point that yes, it satisfies the laws of men, but that
Right.
does not necessarily abdicate them of in the sight of God and in the laws of God. So he goes on, can a woman be freed from a man to whom she is sealed? Yes, but a bill of divorcement does not free her. There is no such law given by the God of heaven to the children of men. And he talks about Moses, law of Moses, give her a bill of divorcement. And then Jesus in the gospel says, whosoever put away his wife save for the cause of fornication causeth her to commit adultery, like we talked about earlier in this episode. And then in Mark, Jesus says, again, Brigham's quoting Mark now, and he says, Jesus answered to the Pharisees, for the hardness of your heart, Moses wrote you this precept, referring to the law of
Right.
divorce. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. And they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder. So he kind of gives this background, and now he's going to proceed forward. Again, Brigham Young speaking, he says, I am suffered, or I am kind of forced to give bills of divorcement.
Right.
I'm allowed in his capacity as the president of the church to give bills of your divorcement because of your blindness, ignorance, and hardness of heart. Otherwise, it would be a sin in me. But how can a woman be made free from a man to whom she has been sealed for time and eternity? There are two ways. All the elders in Israel will not magnify their priesthood that are now in the habit of taking women, not caring how they get them. Get them frequently by stealth. I will diverge a little bit here to comment on the way some get their wives. Okay, so he talks about the first way. He doesn't really come out and just say it plainly, so I'm gonna just say it as plain as I know. If a man is not faithful, the woman is not forced to be with
Right.
him in eternity. Okay. So, because that would be damning her through no fault of her own, just because of the agency of her husband. Right. And so, and then he kind of takes this detour and he starts talking about how some men just basically try to trick women into marrying them. And
Right.
sadly, I think that this could even apply to some of our fundamentalists, people in our networks
The
that,
revelation. Yeah.
yeah,
I've had a
right.
dream. Yeah.
And so we need to be very careful because yes, well, maybe I'll come back to that
Okay.
and after I go through this,
Hold on one second. When you
go
said
for it.
if a man isn't faithful, I assume that's meaning faithful to the marriage covenant as well as faithful to his other covenants he's made, right? Or to faithful to the gospel or any.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because like, in Mormonism, we have this bold, audacious goal to become like God, to become God as gods,
Right.
right? And become heirs of God and to become gods. Like, if a woman marries a man with the understanding that he will help her get to that point, to attain godhood, and he slacks off and isn't worth his salt and doesn't make it to that point, like, yeah, she's not stuck with him
Right.
in eternity. There's this life. In this life, maybe it's part of her cross that she'll have to bear is she'll have to deal with being married to this guy, and he's not delivering on the promises and the things that he had made covenants to her. That's I'm not saying that that just immediately absolves a woman from having to stick it out,
Hmm.
but in an eternity setting context, she will be given to somebody else,
Right.
100%. And if there's abuses, like there are other things that will absolve a woman from having to stay in an abusive situation.
Right.
But in an eternal perspective, that's what I'm trying to focus on is
Gotcha.
she will
Okay.
not be stuck with him forever. Like, was it Joseph Smith? I want to say Joseph Smith in one of the what was it? The Times and Seasons articles or it was in the Nauvoo period. He was telling somebody, oh shoot, I want to say Benjamin F. Johnson. Benjamin F. Johnson was listening to Joseph give a sermon in Nauvoo. And during this sermon, Joseph came up to him beforehand and said, I'm going to be talking about a plurality of wives, and nobody else is going to know it except you, but you'll know.
Oh,
And
okay.
does this ring a bell?
It doesn't, but
Okay.
okay.
He talks about the parable of the talents,
Hmm.
amazingly. And so he was teaching this parable about and he applied it to this Benjamin F. Johnson, I believe I could be mistaken. Forgive me if it's somebody else, but he's applying it to the principle of plurality of wives and saying if a man has five wives in this life and is faithful, he'll be given five more. If a man has two wives and is faithful, he'll be given two more. If a man squanders his one wife, like buries his talent, and just is a poor husband and is not, uh, you know, providing her the leadership and the, priesthood guidance and power that she needs. Uh, where did the man with the five extra talents, where did those talents come from? It came from these men who have one wife and squandered it and
Right.
forfeited their inheritance. And that was really kind of a fascinating story for me to when I first came across it because in section 121 we learn that these principles of eternal relationships and unions are without compulsory means.
Right. Right. And I have heard that before. Once you got into it, that was sounding familiar.
Gotcha.
Excuse me. When I was first reading that, one of the things that came out to me as I read it was I don't think that's only about, making sure you attend your church meetings and those sorts of things either, right? Like I think one of the things with the magnifying here is did you empower your wives? Did you allow them to fill the measure of their creation? Or were you one who was like, no, 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 you just do as I tell you, sort of a thing, right?
Yeah.
If you're not empowering your wife to be all that she can be and giving her that space to do what it is she needs to do to become the best version of herself, and you've attended all your other meetings and you went to the temple, I don't think any of those matter, right? Let's not forget, brethren, they choose us.
Yes.
They choose us, right? And I can't remember who I heard this from, but
And they get a
somebody,
chance, they get a chance to change their mind.
yes,
Like,
yes,
let me just read this one little thing from Brigham. The if they will probably find men who do this will probably find in the morning of the resurrection that they have not attained their end. Wives obtained in this way will be given to those who are more worthy.
yeah, yep. And so again, they have their choice, right? And I can't remember who it was that told me this, but it rang true. The reason, one of the reasons plural marriage exists is so that there can be more than one witness that you were a good guy,
Yeah,
right? That carries some weight. That kind of put me on notice. I have to admit, when I first heard that, I was like, "Uh-oh." Right? Like, so it's not enough to have multiple wives. Let's get that out of the way. Those women, you better treat them right because they get to choose.
yeah,
And that should carry some weight to you. I often think sometimes that final judgment will be a couple of things, right? A personal accounting, but I think for the brethren, the Lord is going to look at our wives and say, "How was your husband? Did he treat you well? Did he make you happy? Did he help you grow?" And if she can't answer in the affirmative, I think there's some issues there. Will be
100%.
some issues there.
Yeah.
So anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, you're good. So just to kind of move on with Brigham's words, he says, "This I mean to apply to you elders on my right and left who forfeit your covenants and violate the regulations of this holy order of matrimony, which is to live godly in Christ Jesus every hour of our lives." So that's kind of wrapping up the tangent that he went on. So to return to the thread of the subject before us, if a man magnifies his priesthood, observing faithfully his covenants to the end of his life, all the wives and children sealed to him, all the blessings and honors promised to him in his ordinations and sealing blessings are immutably and eternally affixed. No power can wrench them from his possession. You may inquire. So that's kind of interesting because wait, agency? What if a woman doesn't want to be like
Right.
but I think that we see things dark through a glass darkly and so what
Right.
I think referring to is once we have the veil lifted and we have the full perspective, that is the point at which men will basically have everything that they've been promised delivered.
Sure.
Um, So you may inquire, in case a wife becomes dissatisfied with her husband, her affections lost, she becomes alienated from him and wishes to be the wife of another. Can she not leave him in this life? Brigham says, I know of no law in heaven or on earth by which she can be made free while her husband remains faithful and magnifies his priesthood before God. And he is not disposed to put her away, she having done nothing worthy of being put away. If that dissatisfied wife could behold the transcendent beauty of person, the godlike qualities of the resurrected husband she now despises, her love for him would be unbounded and unalterable. Instead of despising him, she would feel like worshiping him. He is so holy, so pure, so perfect, and so filled with God in his resurrected body. There will be no dissatisfaction of this kind in the resurrection of the just. The faithful elders have then proved themselves worthy of their wives and are prepared to be crowned gods, to be filled with all the attributes of the gods that dwell in eternity. Could the dissatisfied ones see a vision even of the future glorified state of your husband, love for them would immediately spring up within you, and no circumstance could prevail upon you to forsake them.
Mhm. So it sounds like to me Brigham's talking about this idea, and I'm sorry, this has drove me nuts from the beginning of time that I've dealt with it. Where, well, I'll just give a personal example.
Okay.
I had a guy come in once, guy I worked with years and years and years ago, came in and goes, "Man, I need to get a divorce." I'm like, "Why?" He's like, I just am not in love with my wife. I mean, I love her. She's the mother of my kids, but I'm not in love with her. And I'm like, bro, have you looked at yourself? Like, I'm right here with you, right? I'm not saying I'm any better, but my resale value ain't great, right? And I would be very, I would encourage you to do maybe a little bit of looking in the mirror here. Um, and so I think what Brigham's getting across here is just that, right? I would classify that as being divorced because you think the grass is greener on the other side or things don't feel
Yeah.
quite like they used to, right? Look, I've got no time for that kind of frivolity when it comes to eternal ceilings, right?
Right.
You have to be able to stick it out in those circumstances and work through it. If things aren't feeling like you want them to feel, work on that. Work
Yeah.
on that. Don't give up on it. Don't throw in the towel. Don't be a quitter. Go get it done, right? Go figure it out. Talk to somebody, whatever it takes. But don't just throw in the towel because it's easier. And
Yeah.
I think this is part of the thing Brigham's hitting on here. And I think it works both for the brothers as much as it does the sisters.
100%. I agree. Yeah, so so again, agency will be respected. It's an eternal principle. But when we have that perfect vision, when the veil is lifted, we're no longer blinded by our fallen natures and the, weaknesses and foibles of the flesh, then I think that we will be able to make that choice. And so as a brother, because I've seen good men whose wives have chosen to leave them, you
Mm-hmm.
know, even going back to Joseph, I mean, it's not like Emma left him, but you could say their relationship was maybe a little strained by the end of
Sure.
Joseph's life. And um and it just for me gives hope that yeah, this woman that I've invested my life in and that I love with all my heart, I can have an expectation of being reunited with her, even if it's all not hunky dory in this life. Like there will be opportunity to make those things right in the next one. So
Absolutely.
um, cool. So just to, we're over half done. I'll just
No,
wrap
you're
up this
good.
thing from Brigham. So the second way in which a wife, okay, so he talked about the first way. The second way in which a wife can be separated from her husband while he continues to be faithful to his God and his priesthood, I have not revealed except to a few persons in this church. A few received it from Joseph the prophet as well as myself. If a woman can find a man holding the keys of the priesthood with higher power and authority than her husband, and he is disposed to take her, he can do so. Otherwise, she has got to remain where she is. To repeat, first, if a man forfeits his covenants with his wife or wives, becoming unfaithful to his God and his priesthood, that wife or wives are free from him without a bill of divorcement. Second, if a woman claims protection at the hands of a man possessing more power in the priesthood and higher keys, if he is disposed to rescue her and has obtained the consent of her husband to make her his wife, he can do so without a bill of divorcement. If after she has left her husband and is sealed to another, she shall again cohabit with him, it is illicit intercourse and extremely sinful. So I want to just say God loves his daughters so much. Like he's provided ways, means to be rescued if the case needs, if it merits that. Um, but should not. I have seen this abused, or at
Right.
least heard. I've maybe I guess I haven't really necessarily seen it firsthand, but I have heard, especially when in a situation where, like, especially a one man type of a culture, where women are, you know, a scarce or a finite quantity, a finite supply. And so men desiring more and more wives take more and more wives. And uh, once they ran out, well, they start taking women that are already married to other men
Right.
in the congregation. And I hate talking even about that because it's just so messed up. But I think we need to be aware, cognizant that that is a thing, and we need to be part of the solution, not the problem.
Yeah.
So, anything you want to add to that section?
I think it's interesting here because Brigham uses the term rescue,
Yes.
right? I don't think what Brigham is saying here is that just marrying, quote, up the priesthood chain, right? I don't think he's giving sanction to that. I think what he is giving sanction to is this idea of perhaps we have a brother here who has failed at his priesthood duties, and now we have to make some allowances for this sister to be able to be sealed to a worthy husband, right?
Exactly.
And so I don't think this is a license to go marry up the chain of the priesthood, right?
Right.
I think this is meant for, quite frankly, as it's as I hear it and think about it a little bit, I think it has more to do with maybe some abusive situations and that sort of thing.
And frankly, if a man claiming to hold advanced priesthood comes to you, a woman, and says, "Hey, you want to marry up? I'll
Right.
rescue you." Like this invites abuse, or this can be abused. And I just want to say, I don't think God appreciates it when this
No,
gets
no,
abused.
I think
So
to quote the late great Ricky Ricardo, you got some splaining to do, right?
yeah,
I don't think he's gonna
under
get off scot-free. So, um, and for all those too young to know who Ricky Ricardo is, just Google it.
yeah,
Um, but but yeah, no, I think there's definitely some ways that we have seen that abused, and we have to be cognizant of that doesn't take place in wherever we are, right? Independent, in a group, otherwise, whatever.
right.
Yeah, and if a leader is doing that, amen to his priesthood. I don't know what else to say.
Amen.
I think that violates, that section of the Doctrine and Covenants there for sure. But
Certainly unrighteous dominion, if
absolute,
if I ever saw or heard of it. So
absolutely,
cool. Well, there's just a couple more little
yeah.
nuggets here to just wrap up with this discourse from Brigham pertaining to his children on this earth. Okay, a few remarks on woman. She is the glory of the man, but she is not at the head in all the creations of God. Pertaining to his children on this earth, she is not accountable for the sins that are in the world. God requires obedience for man. He is the Lord of creation, and at his hand the sins of the world will be required. Could the female portions of the human family fully understand this, they would see that they are objects of tender mercy and greatly blessed. This, no doubt, on a casual view, appears to my sisters a glorious doctrine for them, and some might be tempted in their ignorance to take unwarrantable liberties, corrupt themselves with sin, and then take shelter under the doctrine that man alone is culpable for the sins they commit. There are, however, restrictions placed upon women. I will quote a passage of Scripture to illustrate this. And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress, shall surely be put to death. When the crime was thus atoned for, then was she free, and prepared to receive in full the blessing she otherwise would have received had she not committed sin. Women must atone for sins committed by the volition of her choice, but she will never become an angel to the devil and sin so far as to place herself beyond the reach of mercy. She will suffer all that she has strength to suffer according to the venality of her sins. The woman is the glory of the man. What is the glory of the woman? It is her virginity, until she gives it into the hands of the man that will be her lord and master to all eternity. She in many instances trifles with virtue and will be damned for so doing, if it were not for more than 5 minutes. When a woman can truly say to her husband who magnifies his priesthood, I am as pure as you, she ought to remember that it is the glory of that Lord. Is it her glory to have illicit intercourse with a Gentile and then be sealed to a good elder and faithful servant of God? No, she will be damned for it and suffer the pangs of hell. It is her duty to let wickedness alone. Our sisters are very tenacious with regard to a man's having more than one wife. Says the wife, Husband, I am capable of making your dinner. I can make your bed. I can attend to your physical wants. You do not need another woman in this house. Do you not know that that is a curse placed upon woman? Why so? That she may not become an angel to the devil. It is the order of heaven she should suffer in the flesh. You say you will not suffer in the flesh, that you will not be cursed, that you will have the fullest satisfaction of this life and let the next life take care of itself. And now, Mr. Husband, if you do not make a heaven for me, I will leave you. You have a curse upon you that the male portion of the human family have not got. Their curse is to toil for a subsistence for themselves and wives and children, to obtain from the ground by the sweat of their brow bread and fruit, etc. And he quotes Adam from Genesis. Cursed is the ground, and sorrows thou shalt eat, thorns and thistles. No, notice the curse placed upon the woman. Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and conception, bring forth children. Thy desire shall be to thy husband, he shall rule over thee. Yes, your desire shall be for your husband, your soul will long for him, and it is one of the hardest things you can think of to consent that your husband should take another wife. And when you bring forth, it shall be in children, it shall be in extreme pain. Were it not for this curse, woman would not have suffered pain in childbearing. She has taken the lead in committing sin, and she will fill her days with sorrow. She shall desire this and that and the other, and her disposition and affections and her whole being shall be afflicted as much as the man, but his afflictions are of another kind. So I want to just unpack that a little bit. Basically, what he's saying is, uh, just to parse it into words that to me are the most clear, women can't become sons of perdition. Like we've never heard of daughters of perdition, right?
Right.
I think that's kind of an interesting thing and an interesting principle that he's teaching here. And that is that women need to be careful though, because this could be abused, right?
Right.
If a woman's like, "Hey, I can just go and do whatever I want, and then as long as I can find a good man to take me, I've got it met. I've got it made. I'm set, right? No, women will have to suffer. Like in section 19, or is it 18, when Christ is talking about you don't want to have to suffer like I had to suffer. Like
Right.
you should really repent. I highly recommend that you repent. And
Right.
so anyway, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, just that. Just that's not a license to go screw around and then think it can be made all better. Now, want to be careful here too with that, right?
Hmm.
People make mistakes, right? And I know that there is repentance. And so repenting of that honestly and then marrying a good man, I think you've met the qualifications there of not having to suffer for that. But I wouldn't I think it's more about the mindset here than anything else. If you think if it's that yay yay eat, drink, and be merry, and for, we'll take a few stripes and we'll be okay. That kind of passive attitude won't cut it, right? If
Right.
you've made mistakes, get them taken care of, right? Repent of them, get them taken care of, and then go forward forgiven. And by all means, find a righteous man and have a family and those sorts of things. But just because the Lord is clear here that there is no daughters of perdition, I don't think that's a license to just procrastinate the days of your repentance away.
Exactly. Exactly. I do want to talk briefly about this curse. Because, in Genesis, this is a big deal, like the curse of Adam, the curse of
Right?
Eve. And we, especially those of us who've been through the temple ordinances, we understand that we must consider ourselves as Adam and Eve, right? And so, considering ourselves as Adam and Eve, that kind of sucks, right?
Yeah.
Then because he's basically implying that there's nothing that can be done about it. And to a point, maybe that's true, but what I would say is this is not necessarily a sentencing as a warning. Like
Right.
it because this is kind of like really a prophecy of what's going to happen. And you see it all the time. You see women that are in these like abusive relationships and they just can't even uh they're just jealous all the time. They're paranoid. They're just always fearful that their man is going to cheat on them or is going to, do
Right.
this or that. And they're just like tormented by that desire and to control their man. And, it's just brutal when they have to watch their man be with somebody else or whatever, right?
Right.
And so, but I think that is the natural woman, just like the natural man is to kind of be lazy and let things go to pot. And, you're going to get a bunch of weeds in your garden because, hey, weeding takes effort and time and
Right.
it's not enjoyable, right? So we got to overcome that curse. Um, and so I think that uh, I don't know if Brigham had that perspective it does, and heaven forbid I would presume to have an insight that Brigham didn't have, but I do think that is a true statement that that these things are not a sentencing so much as it's a warning. It's a that we
Right.
would do very well to heed. So
Absolutely.
anyway, and then he talks about the young girls trifle with this matter, you will reap sorrow and sore affliction. When you make your choice of a husband for time and eternity, and you are sure you've got your choice, hang on to him, and not come to me for a bill of divorcement, which amounts to nothing at all. I have told you the only ways that a woman can be freed from a man. There are other items pertaining to this doctrine you will learn from time to time. And then he basically men can commit sin and women can commit sin and like we should not like this is and I think there's a reason he chose not to have this published in his lifetime. It's because it could be abused, and as we've seen, has been abused throughout
Look,
history.
we know that to me, because he mentions it twice here, or three times, maybe even,
Right.
the sorrow he feels with the amount of divorces he's handing out. Because we do know that Brigham was pretty liberal. If you were a woman and you said, "Hey, I want to leave my husband," he was pretty quick to do it, right? And so I think that this, bit of revelation, if you will, and advice from Brigham here, I think is a direct response to that, right? Like, oh, we're not understanding, we're not getting this, and so maybe I need to do some further explanation. But like you said, I think Brigham understood that even these things have the ability to be abused, right? And his in trying to prevent more divorce, he's like, yeah, I can see where that's going to get used.
Yeah.
And he was, yeah, I agree. I don't envy Brigham. I mean, he had to be in some ways the spiritual leader, and it's not like it is today, right? Today, I think if you're an LDS member, you don't see President Nelson or the Quorum of the 12 hanging out very often, right? It wasn't that
No,
way in the old days. I mean,
exactly.
they constantly had people beating on their doors like, hey, I need to talk to you about something. So I really think this is an outgrowth of some things Brigham saw going wrong, and he was trying to impress upon the minds of those saints, look, this is serious business, and you
Yeah.
don't get to just skate by on this. Understand that there you are trifling with things of eternal consequence, and as such can be dangerous unless you approach this in the right manner.
You don't want to have to explain stuff.
No, no splaining, Lucy. It goes bad. So yeah, absolutely. Um,
So I guess just to kind of you kind of touched on it, but I think it bears repeating. Just, this is a foreign concept. Well, actually, no, this is even a thing in the LDS culture. Guys that come to a girl and claim revelation, hey, God told me we're supposed to get married, right? But
right.
it's also very common, especially in fundamentalist culture as well, where in a plural situation, the guy comes to a young lady and says, hey, God told me that you belong in my family or whatever. So my advice to LDS and fundamentalist people, young women and young men everywhere, if somebody comes and starts saying that stuff, that's a huge red flag. Run the other direction. Or at least, if it is somewhat consensual, like if it's something that you've maybe already had feelings and would be interested just naturally, like without compulsory means, like just if you want to exercise your agency, but go to God.
Yeah.
Don't ever take somebody else's revelation or word for this or that. Like you know, we can't just outsource our responsibility to make
No,
these choices.
no. And look, fellas, you young men, don't be that guy. That is not a good look. Um, you should never feign revelation unless it is revelation, and even then, I'm not sure I'd bring it up. Right? I would
Right.
probably just put that in the back pocket because it's not a great look. It's not a
Nah.
great look. So, and you're right, it does happen in the LDS church as well too. Um, we still hear about it. At BYU of all places. But
Right.
anyway,
Weird.
yeah, BYU. So anyway, yeah, no, I agree 100%. Don't. get your own revelation and don't be that guy.
Yeah,
So, perfect.
cool.
Anything else?
I guess just in talking about the responsibility, the last thing I'll say on that is, uh, you know, Oliver was promised by God the gift of translating the Book of Mormon. And but in section was it 8 or 9, he gets rebuked, and God's
Yeah,
like, "Well, you just thought all you had to do was ask, and I would just tell you everything." Like, no, that's not how it works. and
right,
and so that to me, that's really fascinating as a principle because it it just puts that responsibility on us to go to the Lord and study it out in our minds. What does that look like in a, marriage decision context? Well, it probably means go on some dates or courting, whatever you want to call it. Certain cultures don't like dating because it's like a worldly word or whatever. Whatever the case may be, though, you need to get to know this person. If you just go and you ask God, "Hey, should I marry so and so?" and you don't know who they are, you don't know what their character, like what their values are, like, and you're just basically asking God to take away your agency and choose for you. God kind of doesn't appreciate that. So let's put in the work. Let's do our due diligence. We can't just ask him, expect him to tell us what to do. We need to put in the work, get to
yep,
know people, have positive, healthy social interactions. Um, and then once you know somebody's character, once you are at least some pretty confident that you know who they are, what they value, what type of a husband or wife or spouse or father or mother, like, because you're not just making this choice for you personally. This is going to impact your children, grandchildren. Like, this is important. And there are stories, and I'm not judging because maybe they did get revelation, but it gives me pause when I hear stories like, oh, so and so and so and so, yeah, they're married or they're engaged because they courted for 2 weeks or like 2 days. And I'm just like, wow. Again, maybe they were inspired, maybe they got that revelation, and maybe that was the will of God for them in their lives. I am not in a position to judge that. But I know that I'm not going to be recommending my kids do that. Uh,
right.
because I just think that invites or it leaves far too much opportunity for uh poor decisions to be made that then there's consequences and
Shenanigans.
right.
Shenanigans is the word you're looking for.
There you go.
So
Kids
look,
and
I this is where the rubber meets the road a little bit on revelation, right? And I would say this to the younger segment of the audience that's listening, get to know what the voice of the Lord sounds like. Get to know what the Spirit sounds like so that when you do need that revelation, you can be assured that you are getting your information from the correct source. Next, I would say this. The Because I don't want to take away, we have a rich history, and it's a history I believe to be true, of men being called to things by, a leader just looking at them, right? Those things happen. And look, I'll be honest, I knew I was going to marry my wife after one date, right? And I was the guy less likely to ever be in that position at that time.
but that
However,
doesn't mean you actually married her the next day, right?
no, I did not marry her the next day. No, nor did I go to her and say, "Hey, I got this funny feeling."
Okay.
Um, I was not that guy, right? I kept that very close to the chest.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't want to take away those moments because I do think they're real. However, I do want to refer something back to an older gentleman I once kind of was tutored by in the LDS church during my early days as a Mormon. We were talking about the nature of revelation. And he said, Dave, you should never apply this um, uh, carte blanche, right? You shouldn't just apply this to all things because you
Yeah.
got to leave room for those sudden strokes of revelation that do come. But oftentimes, good information makes for good revelation.
Hmm.
And I think this is one of those times where that definitely applies, right?
Yeah.
The more you know about someone's character, the more you know them, right? And that is very important when you're making these sorts of things. So, yeah,
And ultimately, you need to actually, so going back to section 8 or section 9, I think it's section 8, it talks about how you must study it out in your mind and basically make a choice,
right.
make a decision. And then you take your decision to the Lord.
Yep.
And at that point, he will either give you the stupor of thought or the burning in the bosom
Yep.
as a yes or a no kind of, you can calibrate at that point. And
Yep.
so, like, I think that that's another really kind of important and easily neglected or forgotten or whatever principle, which is that we need to make sure that we are not asking God to choose for us, that we are not just mailing it in and just not putting in the work. Like we need to actually go to the effort of making the absolute best judgment that we are capable of. And then after all that we have after we put in that work and done all that we can do, then we stand still and wait for the hand of God to be made manifest. Like, yeah, you pray for rain while you're digging the well.
Absolutely.
You gotta do the work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think that's good advice. And again, just do the little things, right? Get ready to hear the Lord, learn what that feels like, what that sounds like, and then put in some effort on getting to know the other person, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's going to be different that's going to look and feel a little bit different depending on where you are in your time of life, right? I mean, look, with Amber, it was very much youth and exuberance, right? When Tanya came along, I was less in the mode of, you know, that same kind of youth and exuberance, right? This was a more reasoned, I guess, approach that I took before I asked, right?
Less hormonal.
Yes, yes, that's what I was going for. That's a good way of putting it. I didn't think it like through like that. It was more like, can she stand me for more than about 6 hours at a time? Right? Like, does she understand what she's getting into and those sorts of things, right? But and these are big things, and these are important things of eternal consequence. But I don't want it to get lost that these are exciting things, right? Like, don't forget to enjoy the process. So often I think we get hyper fixated on the goal, and that's to have the goal in mind is always important and good. But sometimes you got to enjoy the process, right?
Exactly.
And so we've talked about some heavy things, but again, just take a step back, breathe deep, and enjoy this process because they are magical moments and they don't come around often. So enjoy the time you got there with them.
Amen.
Awesome. Well, dude, this was good stuff. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for making me take the the one nobody else wanted to do.
I did it because I
So
trusted you, right? I mean, this was a touchy enough one that I'm like, yeah, we need some folks with some chops. So
well, and I hope it's you know I hope there's some interesting things. I hope it's been kind of humorous but also the main goal, I sure hope that people come away from this conversation wanting to having new insight in how they can and should live the law of chastity and desiring to do better at it.
absolutely,
It's not about the info, it's about the transformation.
absolutely, absolutely,
And if I'm wrong about the modesty thing, like that's not, it's something I have looked at quite a bit, but it's not, I certainly wouldn't consider myself like an expert or authority on it.
sure,
But yeah, if anybody can prove me wrong, please do. I'm
absolutely. No, it'll be good. So, and look, the guests never get the hate mail. I'm the one that gets the hate mail. So,
well,
so
please forward it over. I want to share that if it comes.
dude,
So,
I'm saving it up for a book. When I'm
dude,
all done with this podcast, I'm just gonna wrap it all up in a bow, and there's going to be a book, and it's just going to be called "All the Right People Have All the Right Things to Say About Dave," and it's just going to be the most witty hate mail I've ever got. So all I'm saying is, if you're out there and you're one of those that feel apt to do that, just make it witty. There is a bar here at which I'm judging this, so just know it could be published later. So if you're going to do it, just do it right.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, dude, hang out for 5 minutes. All right.
All right, sounds good.
All
Thanks,
right.
Dave.
Bye,
Bye, everyone.
everybody.